Really tough.
I'm back. Good morning.
How are you?
Hello.
Sir, how are you?
Good. I'm back. Oh, goodness. Greetings.
How are you doing?
Oh, well.
I did that, you know, after I left.
Well, indeed.
The diets?
This side of that.
Kristen leave? Kristen, go back to the office. She coming down at all?
I don't think so. Unless you want her, I can email her.
No, I don't think so.
I got a copy of the Moran Amendment that I put down here.
What does it do? Just strips mine.
It's kind of smoke and mirrors, and I gave you a quick rundown of it right here.
Okay.
But it pretty much says they can go along with the rulemaking so long as it takes in the public comment.
There's about stuff there. I'm so sorry, I didn't even see it.
Statute of that exemption, but it's already built into the Clean Water Act. So it's a funny way of saying that it strikes the language.
Okay.
You like it?
I do. I won't pick you up. Yep.
Last night. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well. Good morning, Jerry. I am well, and you? Ready to go to battle? Yes, kind of nice. let the public have him.
I'll see you later. Thank you again for your help. Yes.
Let me know if you need another copy of the talking points I put together. I didn't know if you see those. Okay.
Ha!
What's up, buddy?
Ready to go to work?
You confused me.
Oh, this is always my seat. Flake fucked it up yesterday.
Yeah, what happened?
He got here and staked the territory, and he knows better. It won't happen again.
Better not, right?
I told him if I was sitting over here, I would have voted for his amendment, but screw that.
You know, he had a chance. He had a chance, you know?
Yeah, he would have had 2 votes instead of just his.
Exactly. Hey, double his chances.
Yeah.
Hey, throw that in your packet. Take that back to the office.
Hey, Danny. Good morning. Ready to pick a fight today? On something? Yeah.
All right, man. That's yeah, good. Thanks for the heads up. Okay.
Tell him Bonner isn't carrying his load.
All right.
What's up, man? How you doing? I'm doing better than I deserve.
It's been a very wide. I do now.
I did not. I don't know where they came from. I was like the first one here, and they were already here. So somebody, maybe the committee did it. Do we? I don't know. I had a fundraiser before I left. Yeah. Hi there. Hey, Eric, did you have Maddie bring me a cup of coffee? Thank you. got another fight today. Oh, they're trying to give the Corps of Engineers authority over all water, not just navigable. So I had language put in saying, no. And Moran's going after it along with the Democrat. It'll be the most controversial one today. They want control over all water. They're going to do it at EPA too.
They try to make a case, well, these are unregulated waters, they flow into unregulated state trade.
Yeah.
The federal government will have to regulate everything.
Right.
You know what? If the different gene wants to say, we want the EPA and the Army Corps to regulate all the waters in your chain, go ahead. Keep your goddamn hands out of Idaho.
Remember when they caught and dumped the sewage? And then they gave them more time to get the problem. Finally, an Alabama member that knows something about approach.
Yeah. What? Dysfunctional thing.
Hey guys.
Daddy, thank you.
Have fun.
Yes, ma'am.
Wow. Just tell me, tell me ventilation system is shut off. Yeah, unscrewing himself, right, yeah.
Are those the old light bulbs? We got to get down there and get them. They're the old light bulbs.
No, right, you've been using them, you know? The outlaw light bulb. I thought you were supposed to be doing that, just tell them to give you the 15 grand and send the picture.
What's the pay for it?
Morning, man. What's going on?
Wednesday.
How you doing? When's your big thing on the floor? When's your bill going to be?
Oh God, I'm being used as.
Don't worry. That's right. You're one of the last.
Yeah,
It will be the last.
it will be. Yeah, I'm being asked to cut back to the full floor in Health and Human Services and Education. Full floor. Isn't that nuts?
Every single
That's
issue
crazy.
there is everything. All
Oh.
your issues are.
It's gonna be ugly. No,
He begged not to get it.
as a matter of fact, I did not.
Good to see you.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought they liked you around here.
Yeah, yeah. How are you? Well, see, I'm number 13 in seniority, and there are 12 subcommittees, so figure it out.
Steve, you were the best damn commentator.
I got the short straw, or long straw.
I was just happy that you were
Yeah, that would have been easy.
That's a 2 minute.
Yeah.
Not very controversial. It's not like you have people like going, no, you have to have.
Yeah.
You're going to kill legislators. You know? It's a guy.
Be able in order.
My Senate race.
We are honored this morning to have in our presence one of the former members of this body and this committee, former cardinal of the committee. In fact, the chair of the very bill that we're taking up today, and that's Chairman Callahan from Mobile, Alabama. Where is the chairman? Oh, there he is in the back. We would invite him to speak, but I don't have that much time. Order of business today is the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Bill. We're pleased to the very distinguished subcommittee chairman, the gentleman from New Jersey, who has prepared the bill and is prepared to present it to you, Mr. Frelinghuysen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to present the fiscal year 2012 Energy and Water Bill to you this morning. I'd like to thank all the subcommittee members for their participation in putting the bill together and their participation in many oversight hearings we've held, and I'd like to thank our respective staffs. The Energy and Water Appropriations Bill supports programs critical to our nation's security, safety, and economic competitiveness. I am under no illusions that this bill we bring forward today meets the every need of any member. For far too long, federal agencies have been assuming ever-increasing budgets, leading to programs with poor rationale and even less accountability. These days are behind us now. The bill for fiscal year 2012 provides $30.639 billion, $1.043 billion below fiscal year 2011, and $5.9 billion below the President's request, bringing the total down to approximately the fiscal year 2005 level. There are no congressional earmarks in this legislation. Yet the recommendation clearly shows that strong discipline and a strong national defense and a strong economy can be achieved together. The highest priorities are protected by supporting the Department of Energy's national defense programs and by preserving activities that directly support American competitiveness, such as water infrastructure and basic science research. The bill supports critical national security programs by providing $10.6 billion for the National Nuclear Security Administration, including $195.3 million above fiscal year 2011 for weapons activities to support the modernization of our nuclear arsenal. Only in Washington could an increase of this magnitude be seen as a cut. Yes, weapons activities is below the President's request, but his request included hundreds of millions of dollars for construction projects that are not ready to move forward, capabilities that are secondary to the primary mission of keeping our stockpile ready, and yes, slush funds that the administration has historically used to address its needs. The recommendation before you eliminates these weaknesses, and it is responsible. The bill also fully supports urgent ongoing efforts to secure vulnerable nuclear materials worldwide, and the full request to design a new reactor for the replacement of the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. We've seen how catastrophic flooding can affect many lives locally and the economy nationally. And yesterday's crisis could be anywhere tomorrow. Through hard choices and rigorous analysis, our proposal fills in at least some of the holes in the administration's wholly inadequate request for the Army Corps. The bill protects public safety and keeps America open for business by providing $4.768 billion for the Army Corps of Engineers, $195 million above the President's request, and $89 million below the fiscal year 2011 number. In order to maintain the constitutional role of Congress in the appropriations process, funding for some presidential projects and priorities has been reduced. Of course, the President's priorities are important. However, so are life and safety projects brought to this committee's attention by members of both parties. The bill makes funds available above the President's request for navigation and flood control, the activities most critical to public safety jobs in our economy, and gives the Corps 45 days to deliver and justify its spending plan. This will give each project, whether in the President's budget or not, the opportunity to compete for these funds and ensure we understand how the Corps really develops its request. Science research at the Department of Energy strengthens Americans' competitiveness and enables true breakthroughs in the energy sector, and the bill preserves strong funding for this program at $4.8 billion, just $43 million below fiscal year 2011. The bill also increases the number of energy hubs from 3 to 5, but requires the administration to develop benchmarks for success for all hubs and to terminate those that are not providing appropriate results. The committee continues to support nuclear energy, providing $8 million above the request for ongoing research and promising new programs, such as small modular reactors, which it funds at the request level. By reducing funding where stimulus funds are still available, or where the private sector is able to invest without federal help, the bill reduces funding for energy efficiency and renewable energy to $1.3 billion, $491 million below fiscal year 2011. The bill upholds historic cleanup responsibilities by funding the defense environmental cleanup at $4.9 billion, less than 1% below last year's programmatic level, and includes language to curb the department's illegal use of uranium bartering.
Here we go again.
The bill also provides $160 million to support loan guarantees while preserving existing loan authority. The bill also includes $35 million to support Yucca Mountain activities, including $10 million at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and enforces stronger oversight of the Department of Energy and the NRC. I want to take a moment to reflect on where we are on Yucca Mountain. Over the years, the committee, in a bipartisan fashion, has been at the forefront of criticizing the administration's disdain for sound science and the hard-earned tax dollars of our constituents. Now, finally, the rest of Congress and this nation is joining the call. The GAO has issued a report saying there is no scientific reason for shutting down the project, and the administration has even been forced to release its own scientific review, finding that the science actually supports Yucca Mountain. Now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own Inspector General has released findings highly critical of the way the NRC chairman has withheld information regarding Yucca Mountain from the public and his fellow commissioners. Our recommendations to you support these findings, providing funding to keep Yucca Mountain going, and including language to ensure that political appointees at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can no longer use their insider position to play games. Finally, this recommendation includes numerous steps across accounts to ensure that the administration follows the will of Congress. It also includes new reporting requirements so that the administration must track and show that the investments we make in science and technology are effective uses of taxpayers' dollars. It also calls on the administration to aggressively terminate projects and programs which are not delivering results. We take seriously our responsibility to rein in federal spending in the fiscal year 2012, and this committee is at the heart of this effort. The recommendation before you today is built on hard questions into politically popular programs and focused cuts where the answers don't hold up to scrutiny. This is the sort of analysis that will get our fiscal house in order. I'm proud of our recommendation, and I look forward to our discussion today, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Visklaski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome Mr. Callahan to our presence today. I remember the days when Mr. Bevel from Alabama and Mr. Myers from Indiana shared the chair and ranking and essentially switched it as well. And it was great to renew that relationship and enjoy serving under your chairmanship. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Frelinghuysen, I want to congratulate you on your first full committee markup as the Energy and Water Chair. You were faced with very difficult decisions with the allocation the subcommittee was given, and I want to commend your exceptional efforts in crafting this bill. You are a person of industry, intelligence, and you are a true gentleman. I would also like to thank each member of the subcommittee for their serious and collegial work, and the majority staff, subcommittee staff, and your personal staff for their great work. I certainly also want to thank the minority committee staff as well. As you have already pointed out, the allocation for the energy and water bill is $30.6 billion, $1 billion below the 2011 funding level. I am very pleased that the chairman and the subcommittee continue the efforts to improve program and project management at all of the agencies under its jurisdiction, honing provisions carried in the past, and instituting others aimed at increased oversight. For example, the bill includes a requirement that the Department of Energy complete independent cost estimates at major milestones for projects with a total cost in excess of $100 million. A recent review of the department's cleanup-related construction projects by the Corps of Engineers paints a bleak picture of the management system at DOE and casts doubt on recent reforms intended to move the department off the General Accounting Office's high-risk list, a list they have secured a permanent position on for the last 21 years under 4 presidents of 2 parties. The science account, critical to the competitiveness of our nature, is essentially the same as it was in 2011, not an insignificant achievement in light of the challenge this allocation provided. The bill also includes funds for renewable energy loans. This funding will ensure that companies that have spent millions in pursuit of a loan guarantee have an avenue to get such a loan and help move our country toward a diversified energy portfolio. While I am grateful for the considerable efforts made in this bill, I do recognize that difficult choices had to be made, and this bill starkly illustrates the short-sighted nature of the spending cap set by the House budget. The allocation for energy and water is simply insufficient to meet the challenges posed by the economic downturn and to guarantee our national security. I appreciate the subcommittee increasing core funding by $195 million above the President's request, ensuring that some ongoing projects will not be terminated. However, the bill still provides $89 million less than in fiscal year 2011 and $767 million less than in 2010. Our ports, harbors, navigational channels, and locks continue to provide the foundation for a long-term economic growth pattern. At this funding level, we are not close to addressing the dredging backlog that plagues waterborne commerce in the United States of America. Currently, for the top 59 ports in the U.S., the Corps is only able to maintain authorized depths within the middle half of the channel 33% of the time. Every day, this costs companies that rely on these ports money and profits and serves as a major impediment to expanding their workforce and creating jobs. This is merely one of the reasons why in 2009, The American Society of Engineers gave our nation's dams, levees, and inland water grades of D or D minus. Additionally, as many members of the committee all too well know, this has been a historic flood season in the Mississippi and Missouri River basins. We know that the cleanup and recovery from these disasters will stress the Corps' budget even further. That is why it is imperative that we make the upfront investments in flood and storm damage reduction projects. Sufficient investment now can prevent incredibly costly rebuilding and repair efforts, such as those following Hurricane Katrina, where we spent more than $14 billion in one community, and more money in one community on water projects than we spent on all water projects across the United States of America. We should have made the investment up front. Renewable energy programs in this bill are drastically reduced. We can debate whether our dependency on imported oil and other carbon fuels is an environmental problem or an economic problem. Either way, it is clearly a national security problem given the source of so much of our energy. We must expand the mix of our energy supply, and we must use the energy supply we have more effectively, and we must transport it more efficiently. I also note, and the chairman referenced it, that the bill adds 2 hubs to the Department of Energy while cutting both the science and renewable energy accounts that fund them, giving the department now a total of 5 hubs. Speaking for myself, this organizational model, I do not believe, has yet been proven. And I have severe reservations about starting 2 new hubs in light of the cuts to the underlying accounts and the fact that the original 3 hubs have been in existence all of 1 year. Non-proliferation accounts are reduced. And while I appreciate the efforts of Chairman Frelinghuysen to preserve some of the most critical activities, the allocation reduces our ability to counter the most serious threats confronting our national security, and that's the threats of nuclear terrorism. The current proposal underfunds, I believe, the Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation Account by more than $460 million. This comes on top of $360 million cut during the fiscal year 2011 period. These cuts underfund vital national security programs, reducing our ability to secure vulnerable nuclear materials around the world, delaying the removal of bomb-grade uranium, and limiting our capacity to detect illicit trafficking of nuclear materials. I am also troubled that the bill waives the application of the Davis-Bacon and McNamara-O'Hare prevailing wage requirements, and further, it includes a prohibition on funds to develop, adopt, implement, administer, or enforce a change or supplement to rules related to the Clean Water Act regulatory guidelines. That is why I am truly appreciative that we are again doing the work of this committee, and I commend Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Dix for their efforts to this end. I hope that through the committee process we can deal with some of these issues. In closing, Mr. Chair, I would like to again reiterate my appreciation for your very good work and for your extensive cooperation with this side. You have ensured that the Energy and Water Development Subcommittee continues this tradition of bipartisanship within the constraints that you have faced. You have done very, very good work. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, indeed, the chairman and the ranking member have done a good chore here. This is a tough bill, and I want to compliment the chairman and the ranking member for putting together a good bill. It represents the commitment of this majority to restoring restraint and responsibility to the appropriations process in a time we simply can't afford to spend as we formerly did. The committee has taken a hard look at each and every line in this bill to make sure that we are prioritizing taxpayer dollars and programs that have the most benefit to the American people, while cutting back funding for programs that we simply cannot afford or that are not performing up to snuff. Bill appropriates, as has been said, $30.6 billion for the Corps of Engineers, the Department of Energy, and a host of independent agencies, including NRC. This is $5.9 billion below the President's request, $1 billion below current spending levels. The programs and projects funded in this bill affect virtually every community in the country. Many of these programs are integral to our quality of life, and the subcommittee rightly prioritized programs with tangible effects on urgent public safety needs and our economic competitiveness. We've funded critical national defense programs in DOE, energy independence programs in the core construction projects, which are vital to national security and which will have an immediate impact on job creation. For instance, the bill includes over $7 billion to sustain the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. This critical funding will promote critical investments to modernize the nation's nuclear weapons and its infrastructure in order to maintain our military readiness and safety. In accordance with House rules, there are no congressional earmarks in this legislation. Only the administration has earmarks in this bill, and there are tons of them. Also, the bill does not fund the full amount requested by the President for his earmarks within the Army Corps section. Instead, the committee provides additional funding for essential flood control and navigation projects that the Corps will have a chance to transparently select and then justify back to the Congress. This additional flexibility will help address critical needs across the country while improving administration transparency and maintaining congressional authority over budget decisions. This legislation also includes provisions critical for enforcing oversight over the administration. I'd like to particularly note that $35 million is included to continue Yucca Mountain, the review process. Just this morning's paper carried a story about that project, a $15 billion hole in the ground that is completely dark now and unused, obviously. This committee has been protesting this foolishness for years, and it's good to see that the rest of Congress is finally beginning to see the extent to which the administration is discarding good science and billions of taxpayer dollars. While providing for critical programs, this bill makes good on our promise to cut spending to more sustainable levels. We've made smart and significant spending reductions in areas that have seen massive and unnecessary increases through the stimulus or where the private sector can pick up the tab, as well as in those accounts with large unspent balances. So again, I want to congratulate the chairman and the subcommittee members on making these common sense reductions without damaging the programs that help keep our country safe and our people at work. The staff on both sides of the aisle have worked extremely hard on this bill, and we want to especially thank them on both sides of the aisle for the good work so far. Is there, Chairman Dick?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, the full committee is considering a bill that is unfortunately the result of a woeful, inadequate 302B allocation. I'm sympathetic to Energy and Water Chairman Rodney Frelinghuysen and the impossible position the allocation has put him in. However, that sympathy does not lead to my support of this bill because of the damaging cuts to many important programs. As I have stated to my colleagues many times this year, the Republican majority has embraced the false logic that considers spending cuts and tax reductions as the only economic tools we have to combat our present economic crisis. But this cut-at-any-cost approach has severely hindered our committee's ability to produce bills that adhere to principles of good governance. The Energy and Water Development Appropriation Bill contains inadequate funding for fuel efficiency initiatives, the Army Corps budget, and environmental cleanup. I'm afraid that these penny-wise, pound-foolish decisions being promoted now will look even more foolish in the future. Let's look back to 2005 when flooding devastated New Orleans. The lesson that should have been learned is that we must invest in infrastructure sturdy enough to protect vulnerable areas, or we again would see an unacceptable level of human suffering and death. Another aspect of the lesson that should have been learned is that delaying infrastructure investments will result in unnecessarily high levels of spending down the road. Since Katrina, we've spent more federal money rebuilding New Orleans than we have in nearly 3 years on every other water project in the country. Regrettably, the funds needed to protect our communities and prepare for the future would be even further delayed under this bill. I just make a side note. I listened to Ronald Reagan this morning as I was driving in, and Bill Clinton talking about the importance of protecting infrastructure. The Gipper got it, so I hope we do. It is important to note that about half of the energy and water bill is defense related, including the nuclear weapons program and non-proliferation activities. Given the current instability in the Middle East and elsewhere, these programs have never been more important. I fear that we may not be able to provide the level of national security we need with these funding levels. And if this bill wasn't hard enough to pass already, the majority has included a restriction on funding on enforcing Davis-Bacon wage rate requirements and the Clean Water Act. I do want to commend Chairman Frelinghuysen for the decision to provide funding for the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Disposal Project and the provision to prohibit the use of funding to abandon the project. It is my opinion that the administration's action to close down the project run counter to the law Congress passed in the 1980s. But the overall allocation given to the Energy and Water Subcommittee will certainly affect ongoing projects in my home state of Washington, such as the Army Corps' effort to end devastating floods along the Skokomish River and the Corps' contribution to cleaning up Puget Sound. The Department of Energy nuclear waste cleanup in Hanford will also be affected by low allocation and could compromise the federal government's commitment to restore one of the most polluted sites on Earth. I'll remind my colleagues at every point possible in this appropriation process, I'll do whatever I can to assist in the procedures of this year's appropriations bill. However, the low funding levels for so many programs that are necessary for national security and the protection of our communities makes it impossible for me to support this bill. I do want to add that I appreciate the work done here on funding for the Naval Reactor Program. And this program is very important. Mr. Frelinghuysen and I served together on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. The Trident submarines are now getting to the end, near the end of their life, and we have to start a new program. And one of the things that I think the Navy has always done well is to protect infrastructure. And so building a new reactor that will serve for the life of the entire the submarine throughout its entire life, with it not having to come in for a $3 or $4 billion overhaul, is a very major thing. And I appreciate the chairman's work on that and Mr. Visklosky as well. And I want us to thank the staff who's worked so hard on both sides of the aisle on this particular bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
Would you refer to the Yucca Mountain project as the hole to nowhere?
And there's a lot of money in that hole.
15 billion.
That's the problem. And I served, I think you were here as well, Mr. Chairman, when Mo Udall brought this bill to and nothing's ever repealed this bill that said Yucca Mountain is the site. And, you know, I respect this administration in many ways, but one thing they did promise us, that these decisions would be made on the basis of good science, legally defensible, scientifically credible. I don't think that's the case here. This is one that is unfortunately Congress needs to stand up and make sure this program is finished. Yucca Mountain is the right place to do it. Even the people down, the county commissioners in Yucca Mountain, in that area, say we want to do it. So, and again, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in not publishing a vote they took months ago, which I think must have gone the wrong way, they still haven't published this vote. I still don't know how they can get away with that. Anyway, I appreciate any other thing you want to ask me? Don't get me started on that one.
Was it alto sax or baritone sax?
I played an alto sax and the B-flat clarinet. Yeah.
Played both ways of the football team. Rose Bowl stuff.
Yeah. Well, can you just imagine that? Is there further discussion, general discussion?
I'll start talking about the Kentucky football team.
2 days in a row. Shocking.
Boy.
Tell him your joke. No, I guess we couldn't do
No,
that.
I better not do that. Mr. Fatah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any reason to complain about the bill. The complaint really is about the allocation, and enough has been said about that. Let me talk about the bill within a very problematic allocation. I think that the chairman and the ranking member have done an extraordinary job. I do want to make a couple of comments about 3 items. One is the work in relationship to our nuclear weapons stockpile and nonproliferation. Now, the ranking member has already said that we've shorted the nonproliferation account by $463 million. This is, but the modernization dollars that the chairman was able to see that we've maintained our responsibilities in that regard are critically important. The work that's being done at our national labs is vitally important. There's some rhetorical devices in the report language about how, we should have the private sector do more, but the reality is that the work that's being done in our national labs is critically important to our national security and not available in the private sector. And I thank the chairman for his commitment, both in terms of the 3 labs, Sandia and Los Alamos and Livermore, that he's taken care of in the bill. Secondly, I want to comment about the language that the chairman accepted that would enhance opportunities for domestic manufacturing, and I want to thank him for that. And I want to say that the most important matter to me, and I hope to the committee over the long term, is this critical skills shortage that particularly in this nuclear weapons space and the nonproliferation area, we have a majority of our personnel complements will be retiring over the next decade or so. And we have a dearth of American citizens pursuing terminal degrees in the hard sciences. Our ability to maintain our stockpile, modernize it, deal with nonproliferation issues is going to be severely challenged unless we put a greater emphasis in this regard. So I want to thank the leadership of the committee and the staff. They've done an excellent job with a challenging allocation. I think, we could just lament bad allocations if it was just the United States of America as an island unto itself. We are a nation that's not a shadow boxing. We have competition in this world. And if we don't do what's required for us to stay number one, even if that means spending more money in order to do that, we are shirking our responsibilities to future generations. So I know this committee has a lot of pressure on it, but we at least need to point out to the nation that the reason the United States is number one is because of the investments that were made in the 40s, in the 50s, and the 60s. These national laboratories weren't built while we were here in the Congress. They were built by previous Congresses who made investments at a time when the country was deep in debt after the World War I. But it was necessary. So I just want to say that we have to do what's necessary, and we're going to have to help educate other members about how vitally important it is that we protect our country's positioning in the world and not shirk our responsibility. So we have done the best I think that can be done in these circumstances, and I want to thank the leadership of the subcommittee in that regard. Thank you.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just have a brief discussion, really a question for you. I really do understand the importance of this bill. I represent a community outside of the city of Chicago, Fort Heights, Illinois, which Money Magazine a number of years ago called the poorest community in America. And it was just 15 minutes outside of the city of Chicago. And for most of its existence, until Mr. Visklosky intervened on behalf of our communities, their water was the color of a cola. And annually, moving fresh water heaters out of people's homes, changing washing machines because of the inability to get Lake Michigan water to this community we were unable to do it. I was subsequently elected to Congress. Mr. Visklosky, along with the members of this committee, prioritized in the Energy and Water Bill the designation of this municipality as a rural community, even though it's 15 minutes outside of Chicago. And under this bill, we were able to earmark money, Mr. Frelinghuysen, to provide fresh water for the people of Fort Heights. In the chairman's comments, he said that there are no congressional earmarks in this bill. In other words, communities like Fort Heights that their member of Congress determined and designated as a community that needed fresh water in the 20th century, we were unable as a body and as members of Congress to prioritize a community like Fort Heights. It's hard to imagine 15 minutes outside of Chicago that there's a community that had water that was essentially the color of a cola. Now, what the chairman also indicated is that in this bill there are plenty of earmarks from the administration. So the administration is now in a position, and there will be a Republican administration in the future, and more Democratic administrations in the future. The administration is now telling me and telling us what the priorities are in our districts under this bill as it relates to energy and water. So this committee has decided that it no longer wants to determine what the priorities are in our respective districts because of the congressional earmarking process. We don't want to have anything to do with it. So the administration is now telling us what the priorities are. On the other hand, this committee is now telling the administration through this bill exactly what the funding level should be for the administrative agencies. So we've now assumed the responsibility of the administration in telling them what their funding levels should be, an overall look at the bill. And the administration is specifically telling us what the priorities are in our districts. And I know most people in the administration. I know the administration very well. And I'd say this of any given administration, including Republican contenders who are advocating their own candidacies for President of the United States. They do not know my district better than I do. They don't know what communities need fresh water today. And yet, I'm being told to tell those Americans who are requiring or seeking fresh water, new piping, new sewers under this bill, that I have no input in that process. And I just wanted to state for the record, as we continue down the road of moving this bill through the House, that this Congress has abandoned, from my perspective, its responsibility. Now, maybe the congressional vetting process for earmarks is broken. Maybe it needs to be fixed. We've had an abusive process. But I don't think, Mr. Chairman, and I say this respectfully, that we can continue long down the road of letting the administration or any administration tell us what the priorities are, and we cannot keep defaulting on our obligations to our constituents. I don't know Mr. LaTourette's district well enough to determine what the priorities are in his district. That's why he's here, to bring to this committee its attention. And through our trust that we have in Mr. LaTourette, his priorities ought to be in this bill. And we can sit here, go through the process, listen to everyone's speech, listen to amendments on what we think the administration should or should not be doing, Mr. Chairman, or we can, at least from my perspective, and I'd like to, maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, I'd like to be able to come here and do my job. And I'd like to be able to offer what I think the priorities are in my district. They may be rejected on the merits, maybe the funding levels are inappropriate, but I really don't need the administration or anyone else to tell me specifically what needs to happen on the southeast side of the city of Chicago and now the more than 30 municipalities that I represent. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time.
Mr. Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would congratulate the chairman of the subcommittee in a slightly different way for finding a way to bring this bill to us with the, as my own ranking member mentioned, woeful allocation that you've been given. I would just like to identify some places where a couple of $1 billion well spent might have been do something really useful. And first of all, these are mostly programs within the energy efficiency and renewable energy area, because the Erie portion of the legislation, of the bill, and of the Department of Energy has been cut very severely from the President's request. First of all, I would take solar energy. The sun delivers directly to this earth a huge amount of energy every day. The sum total of all energy that we as human beings all over this earth use in a day is less than 1% of the energy that the sun is able to deliver to us each day. Most of that's coming from fossil fuels and all sorts of sources from which we get energy. The solar energy program in the Erie portion has been cut from the President's request by 80%, well, by 2/3, cut by 2/3, and cut from last year by 1/3. This is an area where we are making great strides in reducing the cost of solar panels that can provide a huge amount of energy, and with a little bit more effort there, we're going to get it down so that it is much at the same level, at least, as what you do by coal plants, by burning oil, and all the other mechanisms that we have going, wind and so forth. So I think it's very short-sighted to be cutting away at the monies that are going into solar energy development that would provide so much more energy. There's so much of the sun's energy that we could be using. That's number one. Number two, we have in the area of vehicle technologies and building technologies, those are two of the segments of funding under Erie. Those are cut by somewhat more than 50% and slightly less than 50% from the President's request. Now, those are absolutely the low-hanging fruit of where energy efficiency is. Almost 50%, between 40 and 50% of all the energy that we use in this country is used for buildings, the heating and cooling of buildings, and another 30% of all the energy we use is for our vehicle technologies. And to cut those, the efforts at development and new technologies in those areas in this kind of a way is, I think, again, very short-sighted. Fourthly, that's 2 and 3. Fourthly, the weatherization assistance program is cut by 90% from the President's request, and by 80% from the 11 budget. Now, I don't know exactly why that is. I have to ask a question. Is it only because most of the weatherization assistance is assistance to low-income people? Is that why we do this, by cutting weatherization in such a severe way as that? And finally, I want to just mention that ARPA-E, which is not in the Erie section, but ARPA-E is cut 80% below the President's request. That's the science. That's the science projects that are going to create our technologies and our jobs long into the future. And to be cutting those kinds of things out of this, in this process, a couple of $2 billion spent in those areas and a few others would make a much better bill than we have here. And I realize that that's a question of the allocation being woeful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, a manager's amendment.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Frelinghuysen in the bill on page 11, line 3.
Unanimous consent is granted to waive the reading. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, do have, I think, summaries in front of you, and I'll move pretty rapidly. Mr. Chairman, the manager's amendment contains a few items which have been cleared by both sides of the aisle. It would make 2 changes to the bill, one of which would modify the reprogramming requirements of the Corps of Engineers. The other would add a notification requirement to Section 313 of the bill, which involves a restriction on significant regulatory actions. The language in the subcommittee draft had some unintended consequences, and I thank Mr. Visklosky for working with us to address them, and Mr. Austria for bringing this important issue to our attention in the first place. The management's amendment would also add several report sections. First would add report on domestic manufacturing opportunities supported by government purchases. The amendment would also add report language moving the Department of Energy towards 5-year budgeting. It adds report language noting the important contribution that solar films can have to improving current technology. The amendment also adds report language regarding the importance of geothermal heat pumps. It adds report language noting the importance of mechanical insulation to the efficient operations of our industry. The second would encourage the Department of Energy to continue its international agreement with Israel at $2 million, the same as fiscal year 2011, the last time we were specific. The amendment adds report language regarding industrial competition for nuclear energy funding. The amendment adds report language regarding advanced fossil fuel research activities. And finally, the amendment adds language requiring reports on safety improvements at the waste treatment plant within the environmental management program at the Department of Energy. These changes are non-controversial and will improve the bill and the report, and I urge their adoption.
Mr. Visklowski.
Chairman, I strongly support the chairman's amendment and would particularly highlight the fact that because we already have the Army Corps doing 5-year plans, the Bureau of Rec doing 5-year plans, and NSA doing 5-year plans, it's time for the Department of Energy to do 5-year plans. Also, I appreciate the work on safety improvements at the waste treatment plant. The findings of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board regarding the safety culture at the Department of Energy are troubling. The Department of Energy must address what appears to be a systemic issue within the culture of the organization, and I really appreciate the chairman taking action on it.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none. Question is on the manager's amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Frelinghuysen.
I
on
move
page
to
57
dispose of the
after
reading.
line
Without objection,
17.
reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment will provide just over $100 billion in emergency funding for the Corps of Engineers to fight the flooding in the Midwest and to begin to repair the flood control infrastructure in time for next year's flood season. This funding is offset by rescinding the unobligated Recovery Act high-speed rail funds. For more than 7 weeks now, the Corps has worked day and night, and I may say day and night, with states and local communities in the Mississippi River Basin to minimize risk to public safety and damages to homes and businesses from record-high water levels. Previous investments in our flood control infrastructure have proven well worth the cost, as some economists have estimated that the Mississippi and its tributary system prevented more than $50 billion in damages just from this year's event. More recently, we've seen another flood fight taking place in the Missouri River Basin. Here again, we have large rainfall events, this time coupled with above-average snowpack that will test our flood control infrastructure. The amendment I offer today will provide additional funds to the Army Corps, both to ensure adequate funds to pay for immediate flood fight activities, as well as to begin to repair damages in their wake. Specifically, the funds will enable the Corps to clear debris, keep our navigation channels open for commerce, and shore up and repair levees before next year's flood season. Since the water levels of the Mississippi River remained so high for so long, and since we are closer to the beginning than the end of the Missouri River event, we do not yet have precise cost estimates. What we have included in this amendment is a conservative but reasonable estimate of the activities needed to correct known damages that are the most critical to protecting public health, safety, and to supporting commerce. We have not included funding for work that won't ever even begin before next year's flood season, nor have we included funds for damages that, while likely to occur, have not actually been verified to date. This dollar figure will almost certainly increase over the coming weeks as the Corps is able to perform additional site visits and refine estimates. I assure my colleagues we will continue to work to address these needs as this bill moves through the legislative process. This amendment provides a reasonable first funding level for activities critical for public health and safety, however, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Mr. Visklowski?
Chairman, I am not opposed to what the chairman is doing, and I again congratulate him on recognizing me, but I do have a perfecting amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Visklowski to the amendment offered by Mr. Frelinghuysen.
Without objection, the reading is waived. The gentleman is recognized.
Chairman, there is a fundamental difference of opinion as to the approach we should take given the emergencies that exist in our country today and that will exist in our country in the future, whether it is flooding, whether it's tornadoes, whether it's mudslides, wildfires, hurricanes, you name it. We have to have the intestinal fortitude to understand on an annualized basis it is going to cost the taxpayers of this country X number of dollars because we are a society and we need to take care of each other. My amendment essentially eliminates the offset. Because from my perspective, again, we have to have the intestinal fortitude to understand we have to expend several dollars to help the people of this country. I'd make 4 points on my amendment. The first, and the chairman and I agree, there is a need. That goes without further explanation. But secondly, I would point out that in every year, save 2, since 1997, the Congress has recognized the need for emergency funds to respond to the impacts of natural disasters on our nation's water resource infrastructure. Since 2001, the Congress has provided more than $24 billion to the Corps for this purpose, leaving out the enormous cost of reconstruction in Louisiana and the surrounding areas. Nearly $5 billion was provided in that time frame. Yesterday, we met and adopted a revised set of subcommittee allocations to reflect war funding in the defense bill, an action I support. However, I find it difficult to believe that this country can afford to support 2 wars, military actions in 2 other countries, and we cannot afford to provide on an emergency basis funding to protect our citizens at home. According to the Army Corps of Engineers, we have spent some $5.12 billion in Afghanistan on infrastructure projects and more in Iraq, all emergency funding. I do not begrudge the expense. I simply use it as a point of reference. That is approximately the same as the annual budget for the Corps and more than we have spent in emergency funding in the Corps domestically since 2001. The fact is, 70 Afghan National Army projects estimated at $1.8 billion have been completed. 115 Afghan National Police projects estimated to cost $800 million have been completed. 216 active construction projects valued at $1.7 have been completed. 60 MILCON projects programmed at $820 million have been completed in Afghanistan, totaling $5.12 billion. In Iraq, the Corps has worked on electrical capacity development, adding 7,000 megawatts to the grid. Public water and sewer projects benefit 5 million people, equal to the population of the state of Colorado. There's 1 million cubic meters per day of water treatment capacity that has been achieved, affecting 5 million people in Iraq. 3 million barrels of oil unrefined per day achieved, which equals 126 million gallons of unrefined products. The question I have in my mind, if it is good enough and wise enough to spend that money for a children's hospital in Basra, Iraq, shouldn't we, on an emergency basis, be taking care of people who live in places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Hamburg, Iowa, on their flood control problems? If it's good enough to spend that money with the Corps on an emergency basis in Kandahar, Afghanistan, on the installation of generators to provide electricity, maybe we should, on an emergency proviso, provide for people who have been hurt in Cairo, Illinois because of a flood, and in Springfield, Massachusetts because of tornado damage. If the Dala hydroelectric dam in Afghanistan was worth spending emergency money for the Corps, maybe we should help people in Joplin, Missouri on an emergency basis. If we can construct a dam in Afghanistan and increase hydroelectric capacity, maybe we should help the people in Smithville, Mississippi for their debris removal. And finally, in Ganza province in Afghanistan, this will be my last reference, for road construction, maybe we can help the people in Williston, North Dakota. The final point I would make, two final points, is we need to make an investment in the infrastructure of the United States of America so we leave the children of this country something, and not to pick apart advanced vehicle technology research, not to pick apart high-speed rail. Who's going to be the next one on the table? We've got to make an investment in our economy, not steal from our economic future, because we can't recognize and have the intestinal fortitude to take care of an emergency today. And the final point I would make, because I do acknowledge, I take away the offset that the chairman has offered. The Congressional Budget Office has not scored any outlays for 2012 through 2021 because of the chairman's amendment. There will be outlays scored of $1,029,000,000 that this committee, as far as their allocations, are going to have to deal with. So effectively, while there is an offset because of the scoring that exists today with the Congressional Budget Office, we are adding $1,029,000,000 to this bill under the chairman's amendment, which I do not begrudge him. My amendment doesn't change that by a penny, but recognizes if we have an emergency and people have died and people have lost lives and they have lost their property and they need to start their business, we ought to make an investment in them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to correct the record. It's $1 billion we're seeking here in emergency funding. Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment respectfully. The flooding in the Midwest has been devastating for everyone it's touched, and I'm sure we agree it's incumbent upon this Congress and especially this committee to provide funding to meet appropriate needs. My amendment does that. Where I disagree with my friend is whether or not to offset this additional spending. Our constituents certainly fully support federal obligations to those touched by these many tragedies, but they don't understand driving up the deficit to do so if we have other options, and we do. We've scrubbed the accounts that have been provided in recent years, and frankly, there's a lot of money appropriated that has been abused under what we normally call an emergency designation. We already took $1.5 billion of advanced technology vehicle manufacturing and loan support that was sitting unused since 2009 to make the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill whole. That's 2 years. It's tough for me to consider industrial support that's been unused for 2 years to be an emergency. And there are other opportunities. The high-speed rail money to be rescinded under my amendment was also designated emergency funding more than 2 years ago. I would point out that while the Department of Transportation has obligated more than $5.6 billion so far, they have yet to fund a true high-speed rail project. In fact, the one award that was given for a line would max out at less than 60 miles per hour. We must get serious about controlling the deficit, and that means setting spending priorities, even when it comes to unanticipated needs such as this that we're discussing here this morning. I believe it is more important to responsibly fund repairs to our flood control systems than it is to safeguard money that is not being used either as intended or used in a timely manner, and so I oppose my good friend's amendment.
The simple question here is, do you offset the funds the chairman has included for flood relief, disaster relief. Do you offset that or not? His amendment offsets the total amount of the money provided in this amendment. Mr. Visklosky would do away with the offset. Now, it is terribly important that we pass this amendment to provide the funding for people who are in such need throughout the country. We need to make sure our levees are fixed, waterways are open for navigation, and that the public infrastructure be repaired forthwith. What is equally important, however, is for the federal government to learn to live within its means. That's why the amendment of the gentleman, the chairman, offsets the additional spending by rescinding previously appropriated emergency funds. The rescission in this amendment takes back high-speed rail funds that were designated as an emergency 2 years ago and yet remain unobligated. What an emergency. And in fact, we've seen some states return high-speed rail money in acknowledgement that they don't want to provide their own money for construction or to subsidize operations in the future. The offset is a very important part of the chairman's amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose striking the offset. The gentlelady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Mr. Visklosky's perfecting amendment in opposition to the underlying amendment. This has really become a continued conversation by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We talk about a debt crisis, while the budget that has been proposed and is being worked on extends, it's your budget, extends over $4 trillion in tax cuts. It includes tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. It extends the estate tax giveaway, and it protects tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for big oil. Now, if you're getting tired of hearing that, it is a little bit like my getting tired. I feel like I'm in Groundhog Day when I continue to hear the same arguments over and over and over again about this debt crisis that we have. For years, the deficit hasn't mattered to our friends on the other side of the aisle. That included calling a war of choice in Iraq an emergency year after year, not paying for it, while putting in place massive tax cuts for the wealthy, turning a projected surplus into a massive deficit. Military operations in Iraq, a war the American people do not now support, have now cost us over $800 billion. Now, in the name of fiscal responsibility, my colleagues believe that we have to pay to help people whose livelihoods have been destroyed by floods, by tornadoes, and other natural disasters. This was not planned. This was not of choosing. This was not anyone's choice. And in this case, the amendment attempts to pay for that by rescinding funds for high-speed rail, 21st century infrastructure that we need to create jobs, spur economic growth, and compete with other global power centers around the world. You got China spending 9% of its GDP on infrastructure. You got India spending 5%. The United States spends 2% on infrastructure. We're dealing with planned obsolescence as we move forward with these proposals. In Connecticut, yeah, I'll be very parochial. High-speed rail from New Haven, Connecticut to Hartford, Connecticut to Springfield, Massachusetts is already expected to generate close to 4,000 new jobs. And when the line is done, it will better connect communities in the state, it will reduce congestion on our highways, create additional jobs, and further strengthen our economy. You know, people are in need of emergency assistance, and I think Mr. Visklosky outlined all that we are doing in other countries. And that's a reality. And I was in Afghanistan not that long ago. And you know, on a different level, we have eliminated all the literacy programs for U.S. children, but we are dealing with teaching literacy to Afghan children, and I don't begrudge that because I think that literacy is the key to success. But we are decimating what we have here, and this underlying amendment, quite frankly, just it moves us in the direction of hurting our economy and the people who have been hurt in these floods and these tornadoes. And it says nothing about how the federal government needs to be there in this effort. Emergency assistance in the wake of these devastating storms is what people need. They also want us to create jobs. Infrastructure, high-speed rail, that creates jobs. It creates economic growth. It is the engine for our future, and if we do not make investments in these efforts and we continue to cut them off at the pass, we are going to become a second-rate power. We will not be able to compete with other economic centers in the world. And this is what people need are the jobs. They need the help at this time. They don't need political brinkmanship. So I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Visklowski's perfecting amendment and to oppose the underlying amendment.
Mrs. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in reluctant opposition to Mr. Visklowski. My heart tugs. I don't disagree with you, but the fact of the matter is that Chairman Frelinghuysen has actually found money that hasn't been used for the last couple of years to help begin the repair of lives of people who not only live in my district but live all the way down the Mississippi River. It covers Missouri, it covers Illinois, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. My levees were blown up. $300 million worth of income to one of my counties down the tubes in a persistent poverty county. And I can go on, and I can talk about Arkansas, and I can talk about how when you had to open the Morganza gates at Rodney's, in Rodney's district, hundreds of millions of dollars of income just wiped out. Agricultural income, income for the state, income for the, more importantly, for the people who live in that area. And so I have to say that I am thrilled for the first down payment, Mr. Chairman and big Mr. Chairman, because this is absolutely critical for people who live up and down the Mississippi River. Most people probably don't realize that the Mississippi River is the third largest watershed in the entire world, and that fully 41% of all the water flowing in the United States comes through the Mississippi River. Our folks need these repairs now, and we don't need to have a big fight about if we can pay for it. I want to pay for it because there's going to be a lot more emergency assistance down the road that perhaps we can't pay for. But right now, while there are funds, when people's lives are on the line and their families' lives are on the line, I have to say that I'm just thrilled to be able to have some monies available to help them. So I reluctantly oppose Mr. Visklowski. Thank you.
Mr. Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the gentleman's perfecting amendment, and in strong opposition of the offset that has been provided here. Mr. Chairman, I would simply point out, but you and Mr. Frelinghuysen have both pointed out that the ARA bill was passed more than 2 years ago. Almost all of the money that is left, more than 85% of the money that is left, comes from one incident. It had been assigned to a large project in Florida. And under the political circumstances in Florida, Florida refused the money. The governor of Florida refused the money. It was refused. It was returned only 3 months ago. So it's not 2 years ago that it's been sitting there. It has been refused 3 months ago, and FRA has not had an opportunity to get it out. But I need to let you know where that money would otherwise go. it has been suggested that we don't have a high-speed rail program anywhere in any of the projects that have been done. Well, the nearest thing to that is the Northeast Corridor. It's Washington, through Maryland, through Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey and New York and on through Connecticut and Rhode Island to Boston. And almost half of that money is assigned now, has been awarded to that group of states for the Northeast Corridor, which will allow them in most of that area, particularly in New Jersey, to get the speeds up to 160 miles an hour at that, now, which is not the true high-speed rail that you hear about in China and Japan and a few other places, but it's getting pretty darn close. If you can get the travel time down to about an hour and a half in each of the segments, Boston to New York and New York to Washington, then you're really serving what is already the largest portion, the majority of the passengers and much increased passenger service for those people who use that corridor. So if you're for those states, that's where the major portion of the money is. But it then also includes from Chicago to Detroit, passing through Indiana, as the other place where a larger portion of that money is stacked, essentially, at $400 million or thereabouts dollars. Thirdly, there is some money that goes into New York, in the upstate parts of New York and in the outstate parts of Pennsylvania. So the very largest portion of all of that money that is being proposed to be rescinded here is assigned, coming from the one refusal of $2 billion 3 months ago. That rescission should not be passed, should not be used against the high-speed rail program and its possibilities of completion, of development. I think I have covered all of the places where that corridor really fits, and I support the gentleman's perfecting amendment and will oppose the rescission.
The gentleman yield?
I do yield.
I don't know where this negative characterization of the Recovery Act money's use came from, but let me just say, the evidence that the gentleman's just given about the Northeast Corridor, about the Midwest, it simply isn't true. And I can add one other piece of evidence, North Carolina. We're going to have 4,000 jobs, high-speed rail, genuine high-speed rail, 100 miles an hour average from Raleigh to Charlotte. It's going to be completed, up and running by virtue of this Recovery Act money. It is exactly the way that it was designed to work. So I would add that piece of evidence as well.
Now the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support for Mr. McCloskey's amendment, and somewhat in shock that the chairman went after that offset, because without giving you any more information than you need to have, the chairman and I and a couple of other folks find ourselves using that kind of transportation mode on our way home every week. And we know the importance of high-speed rail travel. But we also know the importance of high-speed rail in terms of how our country moves ahead. We seem to be a country that is so advanced in so many ways, and then in a couple of areas we are terrified of moving ahead. And one of them is that. We have another fear that I deal with, which is we have a fear of languages. If anybody speaks more than one language, it's going to destroy the country somehow. But we also have this fear, I think, of just moving into this century and competing with other countries and moving ahead with high-speed rail. And so I was shocked to find out that a chairman who would be supportive of this, and I'm sure he is personally, would be taking that offset. But the bigger issue here is the whole issue as Mr. Laurel said, of the fact that we've had a deficit for years, and both sides want to address it. But we didn't get this way because we were building too many fast trains. We didn't get this way because we were feeding people. We got this way because we were paying for a war without really paying for a war that we shouldn't have been in the first place. We're still looking for the weapons of mass destruction. I can tell you where to find them. You find them in hunger and poverty and in the environment and in other issues. Those are the ones that threaten us. Still looking for them. We haven't found them. And then at the same time that we were spending that money and not paying for it, we were giving tax cuts to people that didn't deserve it, and some of them who themselves said didn't deserve it. Again, as Mr. Laurel said, I know some of you are tired of hearing that from us, but we're getting a little tired of telling us that somehow the deficit was caused by people living beyond their means. No, that deficit was caused because we got into a war we shouldn't have. Whether we like to hear it or not, President Clinton left us a surplus. That's a fact. Those are numbers. You can't deny numbers. And this is where we find ourselves. And so I would hope that as we do this bill today, and as we move forward, we try to get off this mantra that says that we will cut the budget and cut the budget and cut the deficit and cut the deficit, and at the same time destroy everything we've gained and everything we've built in this country. You see it all across. Every bill that will come before you attacks science research, attacks education, attacks everything under the heading of a cut. So now we have high-speed rail, something that is necessary. Do we need to help the people in the flood areas? Absolutely. But you're telling me that that cannot be emergency funding, but Iraq has always been emergency funding? Or Afghanistan is emergency funding? That is wrong. That is not the way to approach it, and I hope we would see it that way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latham.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think everybody wants to see true high-speed rail, okay? There's no question about that. I would ask anybody to show us their plan for this money. There is no plan. There is a plan nowhere. And that's what my concern is. And you talk about, the recovery, Mr. Price, can't believe people, don't believe the stimulus bill was a success. I mean, this is 1 year anniversary of the summer of recovery, right? And where are the jobs? The fact of the matter is they're spending a whole bunch of money trying to find somebody to take this money because the states are rejecting it because they can't afford the operating costs of it. And it simply is, there's no plan out there. And I will tell you, in Iowa, where we are getting dumped on right now, the Missouri River is flooded out of its banks. It's going to be that way because of the way the Corps managed the Missouri River for several months. There is a disaster out there. Tell me what's more important, a pie in the sky, no plan money, or actually taking care of a disaster that we can see today. And that's what the debate is. Do we take care of a disaster we know about, or somebody's pie in the sky out here? The secretary came out the week before the election to Iowa last year, said, I'm going to give you $230 million for high-speed rail from Chicago to Iowa City. Sounds wonderful. You know what that is? It's 53 miles an hour. You can take a bus and get there faster, and half as much as what they're going to charge. And the state of Iowa is not funding it because they can't afford the operation costs. And that's why they're rejecting this money. But there is no plan out there, folks. There is a real disaster in the Missouri River. Ms. Emerson has the same situation on the Mississippi that she had earlier this year. So it's a matter of priorities. Fund a pie in the sky, or actually fund a real disaster. That is the question, and I yield back.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me rise in strong support of the Visclosky Amendment and in opposition to the Chairman's amendment. And let me just clarify the record out of respect for the gentleman from Iowa. The state of Illinois does have a plan for high-speed rail. Our plan is before the Department of Transportation. In fact, every state that is returning their high-speed rail money to the federal government, the state of Illinois stands ready, willing, and able to accept the money that you are rejecting. The state of Connecticut's willing to accept the money that you're rejecting. North Carolina is prepared to accept the money that you're rejecting. If you don't want the money, then accept a friendly amendment to those of us who do need it and those of us who do accept it. I hope and I pray, out of great respect for the gentlelady from Missouri, that we don't build high-speed rail along the Mississippi River, given that it's a large watershed and given that there is always the possibility that the Mississippi River could flood. But I want to talk about, for the 3 minutes or so that I have left, about congressional reluctance. Congressional reluctance. And I say this out of respect for the gentlelady from Missouri, who is my good friend. Under our system of government, the only people who speak for people in that watershed are representatives like the gentlelady from Missouri, people whose levees have been blown up, people in Cairo, Illinois, whose levees have been blown up in order to prepare and help save larger municipalities downriver. Those representatives or those people have a congressman, and in the case of those states, they have 2 senators. Someone is supposed to be here on this Appropriations Committee and in this Appropriations Committee making the case for the repair of their levees. They have no representatives before the federal government other than us. If there is emergency money that can help restore their quality of life, someone on this committee, whether they're from those communities or not, need to be not so reluctant to demand that this Congress sees funding their communities and returning their lives to normal as an immediate priority of the Congress of the United States, an immediate priority of the government of the United States, not some secondary, down-the-road, unmet obligation that somehow the Congress of the United States can't find. We can find money to repair levees. I'm not trying to make a political statement about the war in Iraq or about the war in Afghanistan, but the fact that this Congress can find money and prioritize money, Mr. Chairman, for levees, water projects, road projects in Afghanistan and Iraq, and yet the very taxpayers along the Mississippi River who are in immediate need of emergency funding from their Congress, they're being told that they're being issued a promissory note that somehow, sometime, at some point in time in the future, the Congress of the United States, maybe in an emergency way or maybe in a regular appropriations bill, will somehow prioritize their needs. And they're the ones paying the bills. That's what we've heard in the debate so far as congressional reluctance. Now, how can an American citizen have a reluctant member of Congress anywhere when they're citizens, their own citizens, you're their only voice before this committee to ensure that resources are brought to them to help alleviate their pain? There's no such thing. Now, maybe if we add repairing their levees and restoring their quality of life to the bill, and then the Senate of the United States reduces the cost of that which we've added, I can understand that given the nature of the Senate. And if the administration threatens to veto that which we have determined to be a priority, I can understand that. That is our process. But to say that those Americans, I respectfully, Mr. Chairman, to say that those Americans in those tornado zones, hurricane zones, or in those flooding zones, that somehow we've made the judgment that they don't have a voice in Congress until we get through these budget impasses and these budget negotiations, I believe is a derelict of our responsibility. I yield back the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Womack.
Now, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Great discussion. And with all due respect to Mr. Visklosky, I have to disagree with the perfecting amendment. I'm from Arkansas. And what a great, impassioned, emotional dissertation about the comparisons between what's going on overseas and what's happening here and whether this constitutes an emergency or that constitutes an emergency. The issue before us right now is to offset or not to offset. Now, I heard the discussion here a minute ago in the comparisons between overseas and America and the references to Mississippi and to Alabama and to Joplin, Missouri. Well, let me tell you what happened in Arkansas. In a little bitty town of Denning, Arkansas, an F4 tornado hits a trailer house and sucks a 4-year-old girl out of her mother's arms and then buries her mother in the rubble. Now, what I can tell you, in that 200 population town of Denning, Arkansas, the emerging needs of little Piper Evans is a lot more important to that family right now than high-speed rail. These people are not trying to get ahead, they're trying to get back on their feet. So the real question is, Do we offset or do we not offset? And I believe that the chairman and his amendment to offset is prudent and is reasonable and helps us ensure of a future of a country worthy of this child's future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
And I say this out of respect because I want to make sure maybe the gentleman's relatively new to the committee that we don't need to sacrifice economic progress in the area of high-speed rail from the acknowledgement that this committee has made emergency designations which are outside of the process. And I hope that the gentleman understands that emergency designations have nothing to do with the regular order of the regular high-speed rail offsetting process or keeping our economic progress on track by developing high-speed rail and the emergency designation. So you're entitled to emergency designation. She is entitled to an emergency designation. Members over here are ready for emergency designations. There are things and priorities here in America that deserve an emergency designation that are outside the process. I would just thank the gentleman for yielding.
I thank the gentleman. Again, the question is to offset or not to offset, and if the offsets are prudent and reasonable and do not unnecessarily disrupt the quality of life of Americans across the country, then it's prudent and reasonable and should be supported. And with that, I yield back.
Chairman, the Chair wishes to mention we're losing our time. We're going back into session shortly, and we will have to break up, and I want to get as far as we can on this bill. So if the members would keep the comments to the bare minimum, I would appreciate it. The gentlelady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an important moment for us as a committee to think about what is an emergency in America. Yes, the gentleman from Alabama and the gentlelady from Missouri and other places have natural emergencies that are terribly important. For those of us who have faced severe unemployment in our regions and the need for economic growth, those needs are critical and emergency as well. And so the critical issue for us is how to grow our economy at the same time as we try to manage this tremendous debt overhang. And I would like to offer that if we look at the deficit as well as the trade deficit as huge overhangs that make our choices here very difficult today, one would have to go back to the reasons for the difficult choices we face and looking at the deficits that have accumulated. The gentleman from New York was correct. President Clinton handed us a budget surplus. And if we look back at the decade during which he served, the 8 years in which he served, we were driven down into deep deficit, wars that were not paid for, over $1 trillion now on the long-term deficit due to that, and then because of what Wall Street did, driving us into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Over 50% of what we've accumulated of that debt relates to the costs of the recession, of the deep recession. Whether you're talking about the bad paper that was turned over to Fannie and Freddie and Ginnie Mae and so forth and FHA, all the foreclosures around the country, the lack of revenue due to people not working, and at the local level to the diminishment of the value of housing, which has stripped all of our communities of needed revenue. The tax cuts themselves, we know, added over $1 trillion to the long-term deficit. And the trade deficit itself knocks off about 2 points off GDP every year, so we can't grow fast enough. So when we talk about an emergency, at the same time as we try to create growth in our country, the question is, what investments can we make in order to help this economy grow? In terms of taking money from infrastructure, that is a really bad decision, because we have to lift the economy at the same time as we have this huge debt overhang and this tremendous unemployment that burdens us. I'm very disappointed in the tapping of the rail funds, which are critical to move people in my part of the country to Chicago from Ohio, from Michigan. That will create real jobs for our country. It is a solid choice. It's a nailed-down project in this country that is real wealth creation here now and into the future. And I'm extremely disappointed in the underfunding of solar research. I happen to represent one of the 3 solar platforms in the hemisphere, and I know what it's taken to build it up, as I see China stealing our industry, stealing our new technology. And we sort of say, well, let's live in the 20th century. We can't do that anymore. So I rise in support of Mr. Visklowski's amendment because I believe that unemployment is the most critical emergency we face in our part of the country, added to the terrible natural disaster emergencies that you face in yours. But I don't think we should raid Peter to pay Paul, because for me, growth in this economy is fundamental, and rail investment, high-speed rail investment, new tech investment in new energy systems is absolutely the way to grow our way forward.
Mr. Visklowski is recognized for 1 minute to close the argument. Would you like to talk? You're recognized. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And I rise reluctantly because we have lots of important work to do. But there have been comments that have been made this morning that reflect on the larger issues facing our Congress that have impacted our full committee here on deciding whether to offset or not offset and how we offset. But one of my friends on the other side was made a statement that is not fair to or just to let go unaddressed when it was said that suggested that the stimulus was a waste, or implied that, or didn't produce any results, when in fact there is real I would respectfully disagree with my friend on that. A third went for the infrastructure work, which you can see being done. A third went to tax cuts to our constituents in payroll tax deductions. And a third went to save the jobs of teachers, cops, firefighters, and to pay the states who had to pay greater unemployment insurance benefits and food stamps and other food pantry items, etc., because we were facing the greatest economic catastrophe since the Great Depression. So that's what the stimulus went to, and it saved 3 million jobs. Now, there's a reason why we have a difference in how we should grow the economy. And in my view, respectfully, is that my friends on the other side believe we should cut spending and provide tax cuts to corporations and the very wealthy, and that will be the key to economic success and prudence. The Democrats, on the other hand, believe we should cut spending, but we should also find revenue in, for example, oil subsidies, money to billions to oil corporations, agribusiness. You know, you can write off $1 million worth of mortgage on a residential home and get a tax credit. Joe and Jane American don't have $1 million worth of mortgage, but the super rich get write-offs. Corporations pay no taxes, and the rest of us pay too much taxes. There's plenty of money to get at in a just and fair way to share the sacrifice as we reduce spending, raise revenues fairly, and so we're not put in the position of offsetting, eating all of our seed corn for the future or just half of it. Whether we do no infrastructure work for the future, clean air, clean water, roads, sewers, bridges, and the like, or just a pittance of it to keep us going for a little while longer. So there is a fundamental difference in philosophy, role of government, and how we grow the economy between our two respective parties, and that's the reality. Both sides are people of goodwill and want the best for the country, and but there is a difference on whose ox gets gored, who the winners and losers are, and how we address our infrastructure, or whether in some cases we let it simply continue to crumble. I thank the chairman.
Mr. Visklowski.
May I, Stephen, may I,
A slush fund, no
I'd like to,
strategy.
I'd like to,
Train from an airport to a city is not.
I'd like to take my time back and address my dear friend. I doubt that my friend could give me a majority of the Republicans to support the stimulus bill with more infrastructure. The reason why it didn't have more is because we didn't have Republican votes to do it.
When you get loud Tourette excited, you know you really hit the bottom.
My recollection, with respect, taking my time back, that is not the recollection of your party's view. They didn't want a stimulus package. They wanted tax cuts for the rich and corporations and trickle-down economics.
Time the gentleman has expired. Mr. Hinchy.
Oh, my God.
Over the course of the last several months, we have seen a very significant lack of appropriate and effective attention to the internal needs of this country. And these internal needs are expanding, and the attention now is beginning to get broader and wider. But we need to be effectively dealing with it. So I would like to give the next amount of time to my colleague here. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
You got to sit up.
You got to stand up.
Gentleman,
I will be as short as I can be. I and no one else on this side has any objection to the emergency of the flooding and the need for doing that and taking care of all of the concerns that the gentlewoman from Missouri and the gentleman from Arkansas have mentioned. What we object to is this particular offset. There is a plan. The plan includes for 80% of those dollars that only have been available now because of the refusal in the last 3 months, that all goes to places where they already have obligations, and becomes a supplement to make that go forward, including California, by the way, gets some of that distribution, including Missouri that gets some of that distribution, as well as the ones that I mentioned before. I mean, basically, the objection on my part to the offset is that we are killing projects that create construction jobs. We are eliminating the reinvigoration of the industrial base that has to go along with the equipment that has to be produced. We have to have our American railroad equipment being created in terms of cars and engines and such along the way. And we are attacking a new transportation program that provides for people in the major metropolitan areas. Our major metropolitan areas are virtually all growing, and growing, some of them very quickly. And the largest 40 of them now are more than 50% of our population, and it's going up with every census. And in those areas, high-speed rail becomes a very needed kind of a thing, and it is in those places that we're already working on that, like the North Carolina, the Northeast Corridor, and California in particular, with the biggest programs in the northwest of the country, in Washington and Oregon. There is a plan. I object to the concept and the allegation that there is no plan for those monies. They have all been allocated, and they have all been awarded. The obligation has not yet occurred, and you are stopping those directly.
All time for debate has expired. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for the closing.
Indiana.
I'm sorry.
That's right. Illinois is a great state.
But he takes care of Indiana. Florida.
Mr. Chairman, as a personal observation, I would suggest I am upset to learn that when the administration went through Mr. Chairman Latham's district, they promised him more high-speed rail money than they did in the 1st Congressional District of Indiana. Second observation I would make, and I only speak for myself as a member of this committee, I am not opposed to the chairman's underlying amendment, because there is an emergency. It's a difference of approach, and it would be duplicitous of me to oppose him, because my third point is, as I said in my opening remark, there is not a penny's worth of difference as far as the effect of either the chair's amendment or mine on outlays. For 2012, it would amount to $668 million because for the very reasons brought up in support of the chairman's position, a CBO has never scored outlays for high-speed rail. But in the end, this is a debate about the future of this country and to invest in the United States. I want the children of this country to live in the United States of America and recognize their full potential. I don't want them living a paper-thin margin economically in the future. Thank you very much.
Time for debate has expired. All those in favor of the gentleman's amendment, perfecting amendment, will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
The noes appear to have it. The noes have it. And the perfecting amendment is not agreed to. Show of hands. Roll call is requested and is ordered.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Alexander? No. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Austria? No. Mr. Austria, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bonner? No. Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro?
Aye.
Mrs. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Dix? Aye. Mr. Dix, aye. Mrs. Emerson? No. Mrs. Emerson, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen?
No.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? No. Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Hinchy? Yes. Mr. Hinchy, aye. Mr. Honda? Yes. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson? Aye. Mr. Jackson, aye. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Mr. LaTourette? No. Mr. LaTourette, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lowy, yes. Mrs. Lummis? No. Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCullum? Aye. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Olver?
Aye.
Mr. Olver, aye. Mr. Pastor?
Aye.
Mr. Pastor, aye. Mr. Price?
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Reberg?
No.
Mr. Reberg, no. Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rothman? Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard? Aye. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky? Aye. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf?
No.
Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder?
No.
Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young?
On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 26, and the perfecting amendment is not agreed to. Does the gentleman from New Jersey wish a minute to?
No, I don't.
Mr. Chairman, don't we have to have a vote on the underlying amendment?
That's what we're doing.
I think we probably should. I move that we proceed.
Question is on the original amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Roll call, please. No. Yes. I request a roll call.
This is.
Request.
Are there further amendments? Gentleman from Ohio. Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. LaTourette, page 58, strike lines 12 through 19.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman very much, and this, I think I found something that my friend Mr. Rothman from New Jersey and I will agree on, hopefully on this particular piece of amendments. It's become kind of a disturbing pattern. We've had 5 votes during this Congress on the issue of Davis-Bacon. In each instance, the notion of a prevailing wage on the federal level has prevailed. The last vote, which occurred just last week on Mr. Culberson's bill, 52 Republicans supported Davis-Bacon. We've had 3 votes in committee. We've had votes on project labor agreements. We've had a variety of votes, and it's good, and it's healthy, and it's refreshing, and it's all of those things. But there comes a time when the House has spoken, and I would suggest that the House has spoken on this issue. I do have to commend my friend and classmate from New Jersey, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, because he has not only attempted to do away with Davis-Bacon in his bill, he has gone to the McNamara-O'Hara bill of 1965 to deal with service contracts as well. So I suppose we haven't spoken on that yet. So as a result, I mean, the arguments have been made and remade and made and remade. And quite frankly, if you look at the prevailing wage rates that are established in your community for a carpenter, an electrician, a backhoe operator, you're talking $14, $15, $16 an hour. It raises and protects the labor market in your area. It also prevents what was happening in my community, where they would bring in busloads of people in the morning. Someone would teach them how to lay cinder block, and then they take the buses to your community and build a building as well, paying them substandard wages. When the building is substandard, they're nowhere to be found, and those workers don't pay taxes to support the schools, the fire, the police, and all the other things that go on in the community. So I would urge my distinguished friend from New Jersey to stop the assault on organized labor. This Congress has spoken, and I would hope that we could maybe not have any more of these votes. They're not good for either side of the question, and perhaps settle this issue once and for all. But I do want to compliment you on your ingenuity, and not only anybody can go after just Davis-Bacon. Going after McNamara-O'Hara is a stroke of genius. I applaud you for it, but I also think we should pass this amendment.
Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Mr. Chairman, despite my and our affection for Mr. LaTourette, I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment. Each time we pass a bill requiring the Davis-Bacon provisions, which this bill expressly prohibits, on any sort of construction, road, bridges, dams, buildings, I think we all know the taxpayers pay more. I'm well aware that we did it on the, and I believe largely failed stimulus bill, even impacting right-to-work states and shortchanging them. You do the math. According to a number of studies, Davis-Bacon inflates costs by about 22% for construction projects. These are added expenses that come at a time when we're really nearly broke as a nation. How many more jobs, union or non-union, could we provide to put America back to work by defeating this amendment? So respectfully, I continue to oppose the gentleman's amendment and yield back.
Mr. Visklowski.
Mr. Chairman, I would simply support the gentleman's amendment and make one observation. In 1977, the real hourly private wage in this country was $19.57. In 2010, the real hourly private wage in this country was $19.04. This is not the time to withdraw federal support from making a reasonable living wage in the United States of America, and I support the gentleman's amendment.
Further discussion?
Just support the gentleman's amendment.
Question is,
Can I have a minute to just back this
the gentleman's
I'll be
entitled to
very,
1
very
minute.
brief. I just want to, listen, you know, this reminds me of when Boog Powell was traded to the Indians, and he'd go to the plate, and everybody would go, Boog, and say, why are they booing Boog Powell? And they were saying Boog. so I take that as an expression of appreciation and affection.
You won. You're winning.
Listen, I just want to, I corrected my friend from New Jersey. I want to correct my other friend from New Jersey. You weren't here during the brilliant discussion by Mr. Culberson on his bill when he did some math that just defies all explanation. Davis-Bacon does save money in certain states. It increases money in certain states. And Culberson said, well, I got a state that has 22, you're at 4, I'm at 3, and so let's call it 11. Davis-Bacon does not increase costs by 22%. There is no credible study that supports that proposition. And in fact, in terms of quality, it actually saves the taxpayer money.
Those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
The noes appear to have it.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Roll call is requested and ordered.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Austria? Mr. Austria, no. Mr. Bishop?
Aye.
Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Bonner?
No.
Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert?
No.
Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Culberson?
No.
Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro?
Yes.
Mr. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent?
No.
Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Dix?
Aye.
Mr. Dix, aye. Mrs. Emerson? Mrs. Emerson, aye. Mr. Farr?
Aye.
Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah?
Aye.
Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Flake?
No.
Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen?
No.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves?
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Hinchy?
Yes.
Mr. Hinchy, aye. Mr. Honda? Aye. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson, aye. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham?
No.
Mr. Latham, no. Mr. LaTourette?
Aye.
Mr. LaTourette, aye. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. Lummis? No. Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCullum? Aye. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunley?
No.
Mr. Nunley, no. Mr. Olver?
Aye.
Mr. Olver, aye. Mr. Pastor?
Aye.
Mr. Pastor, aye. Mr. Price?
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Reberg?
Aye.
Mr. Reberg, aye. Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers, no.
Mr.
Mr. Rothman?
Aye.
Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard? Aye. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano?
Aye.
Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky?
Aye.
Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf?
No.
Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack?
No.
Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder?
No.
Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Crenshaw, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 26, the nays are 22. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Moran.
Chairman, I do have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by
I ask
Mr.
that it be
Moran,
considered
strike
as read.
section
Without
109.
objection, further reading is dispensed with. Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this bill contains language that prohibits the Corps of Engineers from updating its rules and guidance pertaining to the definition of waters under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. But blocking the Corps of Engineers from guidance and new rules on the Clean Water Act won't fix the very real and costly problems that farmers and timber companies, land developers, and mining operations
confront today. Obviously, there is concern about what new federal regulations farmers and businesses might be burdened with to keep water clean. That's understandable. So I offer this amendment as a possible middle ground between the need for clarity and the concern over new regulations. It'll give my colleagues who care about clean air and water, which I trust is all of us, but hate federal regulations, which are many, a chance to decrease permit backlogs, reduce needless litigation, and provide cleaner water for our constituents. The amendment blocks the Corps of Engineers from changing the rules or guidance dealing with federal jurisdiction of U.S. waters unless all public comments are considered before issuing final rules or guidance, and it keeps current exemptions for farming, forestry, mining, and development. Mr. Chairman, the underlying problems stem from two Supreme Court cases, Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County in 2001 and what was called the Rapanos decision 2006. They both created confusion and uncertainty regarding the limits of federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. In layman's terms, the court called into question the federal government's jurisdiction the further away the water was from where you could float a boat. In other words, a navigable waterway. But in both cases, no majority of the court could agree on what a navigable waterway means. What about streams and rivers that only exist part of the year? The Supreme Court never decided whether small streams and rivers with intermittent flows were outside federal jurisdiction, but tried to establish different tests that can only be applied on a case-by-case jurisdictional basis. So in many situations, you have to go to a local court to decide which wetlands need to be protected. The problem beyond excessive litigation that this causes is that 60% of all stream miles in the lower 48 states fall into the category of intermittent or ephemeral. In other words, they don't exist for part of the year. But they receive 40% of all individual wastewater discharges. 100 million Americans get drinking water from the same streams that don't flow year-round. So should we or can we stop an individual from dumping raw sewage into a stream from which we get drinking water because it only empties into the surface part of a river part-time? A wide variety of rivers have already been denied Clean Water Act safeguards because they don't have this surface contiguity, including a 150-mile-long river in New Mexico, thousands of acres of wetlands in one of Florida's most important watersheds, a 69-mile-long canal used as a drinking water supply in California, and an 86-acre lake in Wisconsin that is a popular fishing spot, just to name a few. If we're going to reduce the kind of devastating floods that we've been talking about, that we've seen recently, that's on our minds, we have to hold more water upstream. This is why wetlands are so important. Just 1 acre of wetland can store 3 acre-feet of water, or 1 million gallons. The net effect of the Supreme Court's two rulings make it difficult for both the regulated community to seek permits and for agency field staff to make a determination. After both court decisions, the Bush administration issued guidance to provide some clarity. But these 2003 and 2008 guidances were insufficient to end the confusion. That's the reason this amendment. There's no clarity today on federal jurisdiction over interstate waters and waters susceptible to interstate commerce, even though they are regulated under the 1986 Reagan regulations. The worst situations occur when water straddles multiple Army Corps districts. Under the status quo, each of the 38 Corps district offices can have a different test for determining what waters and wetlands are covered by the Clean Water Act, because each jurisdiction is given responsibility for their own waters on a case-by-case basis. Highways and power lines, even worse. Let me, if I may have an additional minute to conclude, and I'll summarize the conclusion.
Hearing none.
Thank you. All of the following organizations have requested this kind of clarity: the Farm Bureau, the American Forest and Paper Association, Associated General Contractors, Home Builders, National Association of Realtors, Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Mining Association, United Egg Producers. They're all asking for clarity because what we have today and that what we would continue to have under this bill is not sufficient. So before issuing its draft guidance, the Obama administration encouraged Congress to intervene with legislation. We didn't. This past April, the Corps issued a draft guidance to provide additional clarity on this issue, provided a 60-day comment period for the public to suggest changes to the guidance. My amendment would keep the current exemptions and accept public comments, which this bill would not. That's why I urge its support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment because the general provision in our bill is intended to stop regulatory overreach by the administration, an issue which is of critical importance to many members on our committee. The scope of federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act, especially under Section 404 Wetlands Permitting Program, has been the subject of countless court cases for decades now, as Jim refers to. The two Supreme Court decisions on this issue have both served to limit the reach asserted by the Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. Following the most recent case, the Rapanos case, there were legislative efforts to expand the federal jurisdiction by changing the definition of, quote, waters of the United States, end of quotations, in the Clean Water Act. Those efforts failed. Unfortunately, now we have an executive branch that is trying to make similar jurisdictional changes through administrative means. This seems to be a bit of a trend with the administration. They're trying the same with Yucca Mountain, ignoring congressional intent because it doesn't comport with their agenda. The definition of waters of the United States is one of legislative history, and the responsibility must stay with Congress. The general provision does nothing more than maintain the status quo, which is consistent with both the law and the two Supreme Court decisions which I've referenced. I hope the members will oppose this amendment, which will give the administration the green light to basically ignore our congressional intent. And I yield back.
Mr. Visklosky.
Sure, thank you for the recognition. I support the gentleman's amendment. Without the amendment, I believe that the bill would result in increased implementation costs to federal and state resource agencies, as well as the regulated community. I believe it would increase delays in the implementation of important public works projects, the protracted litigation on the disparity between existing federal regulations and the two Supreme Court decisions. And further, the current provision does not apply to just 1 year. It applies any subsequent year Energy and Water Development Act, ensuring that uncertainties would continue. I urge my colleagues to support the gentleman's amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Montana.
I rise in strong opposition. This is not middle ground. This guts the language that's in the bill. Plain and simple, the Supreme Court has made a determination that federal agencies have overstepped their bounds when it comes to the Clean Water Act. Again, I repeat, the Supreme Court said you've gone too far, bureaucrats. You've gone too far, environmentalists. We're not going to let you do it. We're going to make a determination that you don't have the right to have any kind of influence over private property. This is a private property rights issue. Clean water, when it's not involved with navigable, is a states' rights issue. It's a private property rights issue. To make a suggestion that the Farm Bureau in some way would support this amendment is egregious. I suspect you'll receive some letters because their name was thrown out. This is nothing more than a shell game, this language. All this does is get the foot in the door. It's going to give the opportunity for the bureaucrats to one more time have more influence over more lives at a time when we're trying to back the government away from our lives. We don't necessarily want to be governed from the right or the left or the middle. We want some self-governance. And that's what those of us who are in agriculture and those of us who will have private property want the government to stay out of our lives. We can deal with the state. And the states for many years have gone through the process of water rights litigation, probably more than we would like because it's pissed neighbor against neighbor. But the states have done a good job of doing that very thing. This is the wrong way to go. Confusion and uncertainty? No, the courts have said don't do this. Legislation was introduced in the last Congress on the Senate side.
to take the word navigable out. It was stopped by Congress. This is a backdoor attempt to do the very same thing, to take the word navigable out and give an opportunity to have more control over private property rights. I hope you'll vote against this amendment and leave the language as it exists in the current bill.
Here, here.
Mr. Dix?
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment, and I just want to yield briefly to Mr. Moran to deal with the Rehberg statement.
I thank my good friend, and Mr. Rehberg is a good friend as well. Now,
for a cougar,
Denny, you would agree, I trust, with what I actually said, that these following groups have asked for clarity, because actually, I have a letter that they are on the Waters Advocacy Coalition. They're one of the signatories, along with the Cattlemen's Association, National Mining, et cetera, because the 1986 regulations aren't doing the job. We need clarification. And those Supreme Court decisions also requested a legislative solution, because what we have now is a hodgepodge of different interpretations, definitions, and regulations, depending upon where the water happens to be seen. But as you know, the water runs under the ground. And even though a stream may dry up, it still flows in to a river invariably under the ground. And it may cover any number of jurisdictions. The Corps of Engineers is involved to a great degree here, because they have projects that span jurisdictions, in fact, span states. But bodies of water have different interpretations depending upon where that water may appear. And so what the administration is trying to do is to get some clarification, to do what the Congress refused to do, which is to have some understandable approach to this very difficult issue that everyone understands will apply wherever the water, the body of water may be. And
so gentlemen, yield just
yeah,
for a second.
please.
What I understand what I think what you're saying is the two Supreme Court cases have confused this.
They confused it.
And what the attempt here and why these groups support it is because they want this to be clarified, so they have some certainty about how to deal with the law. So instead of being, as the gentleman suggested, that we would somehow come up with a letter that wasn't a truthful, valid letter, in fact, we have a letter.
Well, I can distribute the letter from the Waters Advocacy Coalition. Clearly, they have not supported any particular regulation, but they have called for clarification, and that's what I pointed out. They are all asking for clarification, which is what the administration is trying to do. The current situation doesn't work. It was further confused by the two Supreme Court cases, and I think our putting our head in the sand, preventing any kind of guidance on this issue is not a constructive approach to a very real problem. And it is contributing to a lot of the flooding we're seeing, because we are seeing wetlands go away, and when wetlands go away, it means that you have less water held upstream, more water that is going to flood downstream. So, thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. Dent.
Yeah, having served on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee for 6 years, I think that would be the appropriate place to deal with this issue, whether this is a navigable or non-navigable waterway. I can tell you that the court decision has provided a lot of confusion here. But I will tell you one thing about this, that I can understand why navigable waterways was dictated by the court. Now, you might want to include some non-navigable waterways, water that flows intermittently, streams, creeks. But we also have this problem with the Corps of Engineers looking at drainage ditches and other bodies of water that do not flow in a continuous manner, that are being subjected to this Clean Water Act, and I don't think we can resolve this in this committee. I would urge a no vote on this amendment and allow the T&I committee to provide clarification. Mr. Oberstar, former chairman of the committee, former member of T&I, he had proposed legislation on this. He couldn't get the votes out of T&I to clear up this issue. I don't think we're going to resolve this matter in this committee today, so I would urge a no vote. Thank you.
Look, the Supreme Court twice said, regulators, you've gone too far. You're breaking the law. And that's pretty good clarification, Mr. Moran. That's pretty good clarification when the Supreme Court twice has told the regulators, lay off. You don't have the power to go there. And now, if this Congress approves this amendment, you've waved the white flag. You've surrendered to the bureaucracy. And now the regulators can do whatever they want. I don't think that's the position we want to be in. I think the Congress needs to say, if at all, what it wants the law to be, and not allow the regulators to enact, in effect, laws on their own. And that's what the Supreme Court said. So I urge a defeat of this amendment.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I have to say something about this, and my good friend from Virginia, you know, wanting clarification doesn't mean you're willing to accept anything as clarification. And I doubt many of those groups would accept what you're proposing as clarification that they would accept. So I've got a problem with throwing their name out here, and while you didn't say it, the implication is that they support what you're trying to do here. That was clearly what was implied. Now, I don't think that maybe is what you intended, but wanting clarification doesn't mean whatever you do I mean, you know, you could do away with the Army Corps of Engineers, say you can't regulate anything. That's clarification. I don't think any of us want that.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
No, let me finish first.
Okay.
The other thing that needs to be said here, and I continue to hear this, is that we have regulated waters that are regulated by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act, and that if they're not regulated by these entities, then somehow they're just out there and nobody regulates them. You know who regulates them? It's the states. It's state water. And to suggest that they don't care about the quality of the water, I think is absolutely wrong. And you mentioned in your comment that, you know, streams run underground sometimes. They do. It's called groundwater. And when that happens, if you get the federal government involved in regulating groundwater, you want to start a war in the West, you just started it. And that's exactly what will happen if we allow the expansion of navigable waters into what are traditionally state-regulated waters. The states can do a good job of this, have been doing a good job of this. Yes, do we need clarification? I believe so. I believe we need it also. We just don't need to do what you're trying to do here.
Gentleman yield.
Sure.
Those underground streams you're talking about, can you take a boat down there and ride on those?
Well, they're pretty unnavigable. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Further discussion? If not, Mr. Moran is recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, the point I want to clarify is that all of these groups, and really people on both sides of this issue, need clarification. The current situation is not working. We have 1986 regulations during the Reagan administration that attempted to clarify. They are now, of course, 25 years old, and they didn't work. That's why we have 2 Supreme Court decisions. But they confused the matter further. And this Water Advocacy Coalition, of which I mentioned many of the members, are saying, we need clarification. We don't know where to go, and most of these issues are now being litigated, which is not the way they ought to be dealt with. Now, if I thought that the authorizing committee was going to come out with legislation, if I thought that was a real possibility, that would be preferential. But what we have now is the administration is trying to get some guidance, has asked for public comment. And this bill says, no, we don't want that public comment. We don't even want the exemptions that the administration has requested, which are very reasonable. I don't think that's a constructive approach to a very difficult issue either. I think we ought to move forward, and preferably T&I would move forward. That's where it should be done, but not I don't think we should be doing it in this committee. I would prefer we not touch the issue at all than deny the administration the ability to clarify a complex issue. Thank you.
All those in favor of the amendments will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The noes have it. And a roll call is requested and is so ordered.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Austria? Mr. Austria, no. Mr. Bishop?
Yes.
Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Bonner?
No.
Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Culberson? Ms. DeLauro?
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent?
No.
Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Dix? Aye. Mr. Dix, aye. Mrs. Emerson? No. Mrs. Emerson, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? No. Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Hinchy? Yes. Mr. Hinchy, yes. Mr. Honda? Aye. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson? Mr. Captor? Ms. Captor? Aye. Ms. Captor, aye. Mr. Kingston? No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Mr. LaTourette?
No.
Mr. LaTourette, no. Ms. Lee? Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. Lummis? No. Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Mrs. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Olver?
Aye.
Mr. Olver, aye. Mr. Pastor? Aye. Mr. Pastor, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Reberg? No. Mr. Reberg, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rothman? Aye. Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard? Aye. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky? Aye. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? The gentlelady is not recorded. Ms. Lee, aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson, aye. Mr. Culberson, no.
Are there members who have not cast a vote? On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 27. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Nunley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Nunnally, page 59, after line
That's unanimous
2,
consent. We're
insert the
supposed to
following.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Mr. Nunley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a pretty simple amendment. There's already a system in place dealing with E-Verify, and this uses the appropriations process to help enforce that federal law without burdening state or local governments. This committee has included similar E-Verify language in the Homeland Security bill that passed the House yesterday. This amendment's a step in the right direction. The E-Verify program
is an existing authorized voluntary program that enables employers to verify the name, Social Security number, alien identification number for non-citizens of newly hired employees.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to accept the gentleman's amendment as a member of our, hardworking member of our subcommittee. However, I would caution that this amendment may have some unintended consequences caused during its implementation. For instance, existing regulations include exceptions meant to lessen burdens imposed while enforcing E-Verify requirements. We would want to ensure that those same common sense exceptions are in place to avoid the wasteful use of taxpayers' dollars. As we work towards conference, we'll work with the agencies to fully understand the impact of this amendment and to ensure that we minimize any unintended consequences. Otherwise, I'm prepared to accept the amendment.
Ms.
And
Glassky?
I believe this is a restatement of existing law, and am not opposed to the gentleman's amendment.
Mr. Farr?
And I really appreciate the chair's sensitivity to the complications that might occur. I mean, think about it. It means everybody needs to go through a process to get verified, and that process isn't immediate. What we have in the United States is a process to verify whether you are documented or not. But there are unintended consequences by requiring everyone to do that. For example, first responders. I've seen many times, I've had 9 presidentially declared disasters in my district where the first responders are indeed people that are undocumented, and they've saved lives, and they don't have a green card. I've seen through the Silicon Valley students come to our great universities here and stay here and become undocumented, rise to be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and they couldn't pass E-Verify. I've seen opportunities for children to try to get an education because they don't have a green card, they don't get the scholarship. And that's why we've been talking about the DREAM Act. The point is that we have a process that says you can't, but we don't have a process that says, however, if you do certain things, you can't. We have got to have an immigration reform bill, because without it, you're going to run into these consequences in a FEMA response or any of the things that you could think about in your own district where people can't get legalized, even though the legitimacy for doing that is all there. So just adopting language that says any new hire by any federal agency that is not verified through E-Verify is illegal. Just gives nobody an out. And I plead with you, it's easy to adopt this language, but it's very difficult to implement it at a time of need and a time of personal tragedy or a time of being able to give kids access to higher education. So we need to put in some comprehensive immigration reform if indeed we want this E-Verify to work. I appreciate your sensitivity to it, and I hope that you can work out some exceptions to emergencies.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. Oh, God, absolutely finished.
Is there further discussion of Mr. Nunley's amendment? If not, Mr. Nunley is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the subcommittee chairman's sensitivity on working out some of the details, but I urge you vote for the amendment.
All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. And Mr. Nunley wins his first major battle. Gentlelady from California.
What a badge of honor. At the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Roybal Allard on page 14.
Without objection,
after
reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized.
My amendment would allow non-federal partners of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to fund local Army Corps projects so long as the federal government has previously funded these projects. This change would support the independence of local communities and allow them to spend local tax dollars on local projects with no expectation of repayment by the federal government. The amendment does not change the U.S. Army Corps process. All required resource totals and regulations must be met in order to proceed with the project. My amendment simply applies only to projects that have previously received federal dollars to ensure the federal government retains oversight, and that the federal dollars that the Army Corps projects have already spent are not wasted. I urge the committee to support my amendment.
Mr. Friedman has it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to support the gentlewoman's amendment and willing to accept it. As she states, it would allow the Corps to receive and use contributed funds from non-federal sponsor to continue or complete an ongoing federal study. Authority currently exists to do this during the construction phase, so this amendment simply extends that authority to the study phase. The amendment would provide another option for local communities trying to address their water resources concerns. We are well aware, all of us, of the large backlog of authorized studies and projects waiting for federal funding and of the ever-decreasing budget requests for the Corps. That leaves a lot of communities in limbo, not knowing if and when their navigation, flood control, or ecosystem restoration problems will be addressed. At a time when we're working so hard to cut federal spending, I think it makes sense to allow local communities that want to step up and pay more than their legally required cost share to do so. I do want to note that the authorizers have raised some questions about the extent of the amendment, so we may need to continue refining the language as we move to floor consideration. But I thank the lady for working with us and for her amendment.
Mr. Visklowski.
Support the amendment. There might be a concern raised that communities who are more affluent could proceed over others, but obviously it would leave more federal resources for other communities to proceed, and Congress, as well as the administration, can certainly deal with the equity issue. I do support the amendment.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Amendment is agreed to. Mr. Flake.
I have an amendment to the desk designated circled number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Flake in the item
Without
relating
objection, the reading
to
is
independent
dispensed with,
agencies.
and the gentleman's recognized.
This straightforward amendment simply reduces the overall cost of the bill by $92.4 million and transfer the amount to the deficit reduction account. It would zero out funding for the 5 regional commissions in the bill: Appalachian Regional Commission, the Delta Regional Authority, Denali Commission, Northern Border Regional Commission, and Southeast Crescent Regional Commission. These regional commissions have been formed to address the economic climate. They're oriented to creating jobs, increasing the region's ability to compete globally, and address infrastructure needs. We have tough economic conditions everywhere. I don't know how you can say we'll have a commission here but not here, or there but not there. These commissions, some of them have been going for decades. They're job training programs that are duplicative. We recently had a report, a government report, GAO report, saying that I think 56 federal job training programs. Some of them are contained here. There doesn't seem to be any coordination between all of these. We're looking for every way we can, obviously, to save money. I would suggest that this is a good place to start. I reserve.
Mr. Freeman has it.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. These regional commissions help millions of needy Americans. Striking them would deprive these communities from greatly needed funds for economic development activities. I want to emphasize that none of these programs were held harmless. These commissions were cut from the President's budget by about 10%. Eliminating them may seem to a member like a brave attempt to eliminate more programs, but the overall effect on our bill would be minimal. Totally eliminating these commissions would reduce the bill by just over $92.4 million. But the impacts on the local communities would be dire. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to yield to you if you would.
I'll get on.
Okay.
Mr. Visklowski.
I would associate myself with the remarks of the chair and oppose amendment.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. For decades, Appalachia has experienced an economic lag, even during years of economic expansion. Employment growth in this 13-state region was significantly lower than the nation as a whole. As a region, Appalachia confronts a combination of challenges that few other parts of the country face: mountainous terrain, isolation, dispersed population, inadequate infrastructure, lack of financial and human resources. a weak track record in applying for and receiving assistance from other federal programs, even with ARC's funding. In 2009, Appalachia received 33% less federal expenditures per capita than everybody else. The Appalachian Regional Commission is uniquely qualified to administer these much-needed and targeted federal investments to close the economic gap between Appalachia and the rest of the country, to bring the region's 420 counties and 25 million people into the nation's economic mainstream. In the last 5 years, every dollar of ARC investment yielded $10 of private sector investment. Clearly, ARC is an effective and efficient steward of the taxpayer dollar, targeting these funds where they're needed the most. As a result, 125,000 households were served by infrastructure. Nearly 140,000 jobs were created or retained, and 100,000 students received vital job training skills. In addition, completing the Appalachian Development Highway System is expected to generate some $5 billion in annual economic benefit for the entire country by 2035. The bill already contains $5.9 billion in targeted reductions to the President's request for fiscal 12, including $10.3 million in cuts to his request for ARC and other regional commissions. So ARC and these commissions have already taken the hit like everybody else. But please, give us a chance.
Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion, Mr. Fatah.
And I'm going to be brief, but I think we all can recall the challenges that led to the creation of these commissions, in particular the one that you referred to. I just want to mention again that, we're not shadowboxing. China has moved 300 million people out of poverty into the middle class in the last decade. 300 million people is equal to the entire population of our country, right? For us to forsake these populations and to retreat or equivocate in terms of our efforts to address deep-seated poverty and lack of economic opportunity would be foolhardy for the entire nation. We need to get these populations engaged in economic activity if we are going to compete against much larger countries like India and China. And I think that this amendment it makes no sense relative to our economic competitiveness internationally. It's a way that would direct our country into a secondary position in the world, and I would ask that the committee wholeheartedly reject it. Thank you.
Further discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Flakes recognized for a minute to close.
I would simply say that I think we've just made the case to eliminate these. These have been going on for years, decades. How long can the taxpayer be expected to fund these commissions? It's not just the Appalachian Commission. I mentioned Denali Commission, Northern Border Regional Commission, Southeast Crescent Regional Commission. I mean, why there and not elsewhere? It just simply makes no sense here. And I mentioned these job training programs contained herein are elsewhere. We've got 50-some job training programs across the federal government. There's no coordination. If these things were working, we'd see some evidence, I would think. So I think if we can't do it now, when are we going to do it? How long are we going to be expected to fund these kind of commissions? The notion that every dollar invested yields $10 in private sector spending, if that were true, we hear that all the time. These are real investments, not expenditures. If that were the case, then the private sector would certainly want to invest in this kind of thing. Whenever you hear that, put on a skeptical hat because it simply does not make economic sense. I would urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Time has expired on debate. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no?
No.
Noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Schiff.
An amendment at the desk, amendment number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff, page 23, line 14.
Request
insert.
waiving the amendment.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is very simple. Of the $733 million appropriated in this bill for nuclear energy research at the Department of Energy, it separates out $10 million to spend on a cooperative effort
with NASA to start production of plutonium-238. Advancing the state of nuclear technology was the initial mission of the DOE, and it was hugely successful, developing technologies now used in power plants, submarines, and deep space missions. The last set of technologies is now one of the smallest. DOE spends about $40 million a year building plutonium-238 radioisotope thermal generators, RTGs, for NASA and for national security purposes. This program began in the 50s. RTGs flew in all the Apollo missions and many times since. In deep space, RTGs are often the only possible source of power. Unfortunately, in the early 90s, the U.S. shut down plutonium-238 production, and since then, the Department of Energy has been using stockpiled material and material purchased from Russia to build these devices. Recently, though, Russia refused to continue that relationship, and our supply of plutonium-238 is almost exhausted. There are no other viable ways to provide this power, so the U.S. must restart production to allow any deep space or national security uses to continue. This project has been requested in the last 3 budget requests under the Bush and Obama administrations. Over the course of 5 years, the total cost of the project is estimated at $75 to $90 million. By agreement between the agencies, the project would be equally funded between NASA and DOE, as NASA has the largest need for the power and DOE has the expertise and would build and maintain the facility. I'm also working to get $10 million in the CGS bill from NASA. This 50-50 cost share is consistent with a decades-long history of the RTG program, in which NASA has paid for each RTG produced and DOE has paid for the infrastructure. In the context of the nuclear energy budget, this is a small thing, but it would have an outsized influence on our ability to do the space exploration that the U.S. is known for around the world.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the amendment. The gentleman's amendment increases funding for the plutonium-238 production restart project to $10 million. To do so, funding for other valuable nuclear energy activities would have to be cut, including advanced reactor concept research, fuel cycle development, and promising avenues like small modular reactors, licensing, and research. The administration has proposed this new project for several years in order to increase domestic supplies of plutonium-238. The vast majority of this material would be used by NASA for in-space power supplies and only a small fraction used by the Department of Energy. Unfortunately, after the committee repeatedly expressed concerns since fiscal year 2010, the administration once again proposed new 2012 budget request for the Department of Energy to share a full half of the project's financial cost. The administration has neither altered its stance nor addressed, or I may say, even acknowledged the committee's concerns. The funding scheme in the budget request and the amendment simply doesn't make sense, and the report is written includes language expressing these specific objections and asking the administration to develop a more sensible and a more fair plan. I oppose the amendment and urge members to do likewise.
Mr. Visclosky.
Reluctantly, I would join the chair in opposition to the amendment. I believe the chair stated the proposition correctly. The fact is, the gentleman from California is proposing to divert funding from other activities within nuclear energy for an activity that has no established mission requirement for the Department of Energy, and he did reference report language.
Mr. Schiff's recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman would yield for just one quick second. I think that the committee, I understand the chair and the ranking member, but I think this is unnecessarily adversarial to the general interest of the nation. It is true that Russia has cut off our supply. That has created a dynamic in which the nation, both in our weapons and in our space missions, need to have access. And I think that it would be far better for us to be working in a collaborative way to try to address the country's needs. This is not a battle between the administration and the Congress. The country has need of plutonium, and we need to be trying to find a way to do that. I would hope that we could work between now and the floor, maybe with the chairman's help and others, to try to find a way to move forward in this way.
Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we're talking about here is not new money. We're talking about $733 million that's already in the bill for nuclear energy research. We're talking about $10 million of the $733 million. Does anyone in this room think that we don't need the plutonium-238? Does anyone not want to continue to do deep space missions? Well, the Russians won't give it to us, and we don't have enough of it. We are already reliant on the Russians now to go to the space station. We're going to be reliant on the Russians who are saying no for our plutonium. So if we decide several years from now, okay, we do need this, we have to start production, it's going to take 5 years to produce it, and that means that any deep space mission is going to take another 5 years. This has got to get done. All we're quibbling about here is whether it's paid for by NASA completely or it's paid for by DOE completely, and both agencies have said what makes sense is to split it down the middle. And why is that? Because DOE has always done this. They have the infrastructure to do it. We don't want NASA in the business of building these nuclear devices, but at the same time NASA uses it, so this equal division makes a lot of sense, and I would urge an aye vote.
All time has expired. All in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Noes appear to have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Let me announce that we only have about a half hour left before we must vacate the room. So I would hope that members would be brief in their remarks. In fact, I would hope that we could agree to limit our remarks to no more than 3 minutes rather than 5 in order to try to finish the bill. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk,
Clerk will read.
and I ask unanimous consent to
Without
waive it.
objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentlelady's
Unanimous
recognized.
consent to waive it. My amendment, which I'm offering with Mr. Hinchy, would remove 2 sentences from the report pertaining to hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Fracking is the process of mixing sand, chemicals, and water, injecting the mixture at a high frequency into underground shale rock formations to extract natural gas. In May, Secretary Chu announced a working group of environmental, industry, and state regulatory experts tasked with recommending best practices for hydraulic fracturing. The report states that the committee is concerned that the selected panel members, quote, will not adequately represent industry's perspective, and that no less than 1/3 of panel members should be industry representatives who actively work in the natural gas industry. If this language were to become law, the Secretary would be forced to stop the work of the panel to add additional oil and gas industry executives to a working group that is supposed to determine best practices for the industry. This amendment would simply remove these 2 sentences of concern to continue the work of the 7-member panel, which already has members of the industry on board. Please note this amendment is not a referendum on natural gas, fracking, or the environment. Regardless of the way we all stand on this important issue, we can all agree that we should we should have language that is accurate, and we should remove language that is inaccurate, inappropriate, and facilitates conflicts of industry. I ask for your support.
Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the amendment. The gentlewoman's amendment would remove report language directly in the Department of Energy to give industry a seat at the table in shale gas discussions. Regardless of one's views on hydraulic fracturing, that technique has opened up an undeniably vast and untapped domestic energy source. Early last month, the Secretary of Energy announced a group that will make recommendations on ways the department can improve safety and environmental performance of hydraulic fracturing. This issue has been controversial, and it is important that industry, government, and public interest groups work together to ensure that we safely and effectively take advantage of this large resource. The language in the report, as written, simply directs the department to ensure that at least 1/3 of the group is comprised of industry representatives. Adequate industry representation ensures that the group is knowledgeable on the latest technologies. Perhaps more importantly, it invites industry to participate rather than fostering antagonism. It brings representatives of government, industry, and environmental safety to the same table where they all should be. It is better to slightly delay the process than continue moving forward without a proper and productive balance within the panel. I regret I must oppose her amendment, but I urge members to do so as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Hinchey?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to express my appreciation for Ms. Lowy and the article that she's brought forward and the authenticity of it. It's actually something that really should be dealt with. As she pointed out, the language that our amendment that we've introduced here would strike, the language that we're striking is both inaccurate and inappropriate. Industry is already well represented on the 7-member committee appointed by the Energy Secretary to make recommendations on best practices for hydraulic fracturing. That obviously is something that is not equal, not fair, not reasonable. In fact, I and many others believe industry has too many panel seats. 6 of the 7 panel members, including the panel chairman, have financial ties to companies involved in hydraulic fracturing operations. So the claim that industry is not represented here is just not true. However, the report language that our language would strike is also that language which we want to strike is completely inappropriate. By promoting the appointment of members with clear conflicts of interest to a federal advisory subcommittee, the report language also flies in the face of the spirit of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which prohibits members of advisory committees from having financial conflicts of interest unless an agency cannot find enough qualified members for the committee. This is a simple thing that's set out there just to make this whole thing fair. So it's clear, not that the case here, there are plenty of qualified scientists, engineers, and consultants without financial ties who can serve on this advisory committee on this whole issue of the way in which this fracking operation takes place. The report language that we're focusing on would represent a major step backward if it is left intact. Federal advisory boards are supposed to be unbiased, impartial, and bodies that advise our agencies and advise them accurately and effectively. There shouldn't be financial conflicts of interest, and this committee shouldn't be promoting these conflicts of interest. As all of us know, there is a lot of controversy surrounding shale gas production and high-volume hydraulic fracturing. That is the reason why the Secretary has established this advisory panel in the first place. A number of recent reports and incidents are raising serious concerns about hydraulic fracturing. I'll just mention a couple of them. A study by researchers at Duke University found a statistically significant correlation between methane contamination of drinking water wells and their proximity to shale gas drilling sites. On April 20th of this year, thousands of gallons of hydraulic fracturing fluid spilled into the Susquehanna River watershed following a major fracking well blowout in Leroy Thompson, Pennsylvania. In addition, a series of articles in the New York Times and other publications reveal widespread problems surrounding shale gas production in Pennsylvania, as well as other states with significant shale plays, including water contamination, air pollution, and other health and quality issues. So this is a situation that really needs to be addressed. And there is language here that is not accurate, it's not effective, and it should be overcome.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much for the 3 minutes that you gave me, sir. Thank you.
It was 5 minutes that you took. Mr. Visklowski.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. I don't think it's our role to dictate to the administration as to who ought to be serving on these types of panels. I would point out, as Mr. Hinchey referenced, one of the people on the panel currently serves on the board of Tierney Energy, has served for a decade on the board of directors for Schlumberger. Another is a senior advisor to Baker Hughes, and the list goes on, so I would support the amendment.
Mr. Dent.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't mean to speak on this, but since the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was raised, I do want to let everyone here know that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is aggressively moving forward with Marcellus Shale development. We have advisory boards as well at the state level that include leaders from academia, Penn State, the environmental community, as well as industry to better inform our decisions. I would oppose this amendment. I understand that many in New York State have reservations or are utterly opposed to the development of our Marcellus Shale, but in the Commonwealth we are advancing this. It's having a transformational impact on our economy, particularly in our most rurally depressed areas. We're actually seeing real economic activity, and not to mention the fact this can transform the way we live and how we consume energy in this country, and certainly lessen our dependence on foreign oil. So I would rise in opposition to this amendment.
Ms. Lowy is recognized to close the debate.
Before voting on this amendment, I want to remind my colleagues that this is not about energy or environmental policy. This amendment is about conflicts of interest in a federal advisory panel and ensuring that recommendations are based on best practices, not the practices of select industry representatives. The committee should encourage the development of clean, renewable energies that will reduce our dependence on foreign oil and create jobs, not handcuff experts who act in the public's best interest and let the fox guard the henhouse. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
All time has expired. All in favor of the amendments signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. Noes seem to have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded. Oh, come
Insufficient number of hands.
Oh.
Sufficient
But I
number of
asked for a
hands.
recorded.
Sufficient number. Clerk will call.
Mr. Adderholt, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Austria, Mr. Bishop, Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Bonner? Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro?
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart?
Maurice?
Mr. Diaz-Balart, no.
Yes.
Mr. Dix? Aye. Mr. Dix, aye. Mr. Mrs. Emerson? No. Mrs. Emerson, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah?
The industry.
Mr. Fatah, aye.
Amendment says
Mr. Flake?
more than
Mr.
well,
Flake,
it says
no.
fewer
Mr. Frelinghuysen?
than
Mr.
one-third.
Frelinghuysen, no.
It would be
Ms.
fewer
Granger?
people on their
Ms.
panel.
Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Hinchy?
It says no less than a third.
Mr. Hinchy, aye. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson?
Right, but they already have.
Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham, no. Mr. Latham, no. Mr. La Tourette? Mr. La Tourette, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. Lummis?
No.
Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCullum?
Aye.
Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Olver?
Yes.
Mr. Olver, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Reberg? No. Mr. Reberg, no. Mr. Rogers? Nope. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rothman? Aye. Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roy Ball Allard?
Aye.
Ms. Roy Ball Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky? Aye. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young?
Mr. Lewis votes aye.
Mr. Jackson votes aye.
Mr. Austria?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
You're not recorded.
No vote.
Right. Mr. Austria votes no.
Have all members voted?
No, I just noticed. Well, no, I looked at it.
On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 25. The amendment is denied. Mr. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I have two amendments at the desk, and I will take up amendment number 1.
Clerk will read.
And with unanimous.
Amendment offered by
Without
Ms.
objection,
McCollum
the
at the
reading
end
is
of the bill.
dispensed with, and the
Thank you.
gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chair, this is the same amendment that we have been putting on some of the other bills, just saying that people who have been found guilty, corporations that have been found guilty of a felony are not eligible for 24 months for receiving money from this bill.
Mr.
We're pleased to accept the amendment.
Thank you.
And the amendment is accepted. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Amendment is agreed to. Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 2 up, which should have a technical correction reflected at the clerk's desk, taking out or state on line 5.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. McCollum at the end of the bill before any short
Mr.
title.
Chairman, we can
Insert
waive-
the following.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady's
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, this is an amendment that we voted on before, which deals with people who are, corporations who have not paid their taxes not being eligible for 24 months.
Mr. Chairman, we accept.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Amendment is agreed to. Mr. Flake.
I have amendment circled number 4.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr.
Asking
Flake,
members'
page
consent to waive.
22,
Without
line
objection,
18,
the reading is dispensed
insert.
with. Gentleman is recognized.
This amendment would simply prohibit for-profit entities from receiving grants in the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Program and the Fossil Energy Research and Development Program. I don't know why in the world we're funding this fossil energy research and development program at all. We often complain, a lot of us, about funding big oil and big oil subsidies. And here we are with a fossil energy research and development program here. We've been using fossil energy for a couple hundred years. We'll be using it for a couple hundred years. And why we subsidize this in this way, I have no idea. One of the companies receiving significant grants in the past year, in 2009, USAspending.gov showed that General Electric in 2010, General Electric didn't pay any taxes, we hear often, yet they received $31 million for advanced integrated gasification combined cycle gas turbine development. General Motors received a big grant as well. Why in the world we're subsidizing these big corporations, for-profit corporations, for fossil energy research is just ludicrous. So this would simply say no money goes to for-profit entities under this grant program.
Mr. Friedrichsen.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the amendment. The gentleman's amendment would restrict energy efficiency and renewable energy and fossil energy research grants from going to the private sector, preventing worthwhile activities that make our energy sector more secure and help us compete. I strongly believe the Department of Energy should not improperly intervene in the private sector or fund activities that industry would fund itself. The bill, therefore, eliminates programs best left to the private sector, like a $200 million program that would purchase electric vehicle charging stations. But after these deep cuts, and they are deep, with energy efficiency and renewable energy being cut to a full 42% below fiscal year 2010, there is a proper role for the federal government to work with the private sector on technology innovation. All grants to the private sector are fully and openly competed. This amendment would hamstring efforts to help America compete in a rapidly evolving energy sector. I therefore oppose the amendment and urge our members to do likewise.
Mr. Visklowski.
I associate myself with the chairman's remarks and oppose the amendment.
In closing, Mr. Flake's recognized.
Let me just say that Mr. Dix mentioned yesterday that I'm somewhat of a prognosticator. I know where the votes are. I think the votes are with me on this one. I'd like to see people line up behind giving for-profit entities like General Electric, that paid no taxes last year, massive subsidies in the area of fossil energy. And so I would ask for a yes vote on this. If I get a yes vote,
Would you like a record vote since you're so confident?
That's what I'm saying. If it's called for the yeas, I won't call for a record vote, obviously. But if it is not, I'll call for.
All time has expired. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is agreed.
I'll call for a recorded on that.
Roll call vote is requested. Is there a sufficient number? The clerk will call.
Yeah, I'm going to vote for it.
Mr. Adderholt, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Austria, Mr. Austria, no. Mr. Bishop, Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Bonner, Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert, Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw, Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Culberson, Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro,
No, no.
Ms. DeLauro,
I voted aye.
aye. Mr. Dent, Mr. Diaz, Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart, Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Dix,
No.
Mr. Dix, no. Mrs. Emerson, Mrs. Emerson, no. Mr. Farr, Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah, Mr. Fatah, no. Mr. Flake,
Aye.
Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen, Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger, Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves, Mr. Graves, no. Aye, excuse me. Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Hinchy? Mr. Hinchy, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson? Ms. Capter?
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, yes. Aye. Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Mr. LaTourette? Mr. LaTourette, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally?
No.
Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Olver?
No.
Mr. Olver, no. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Reberg? Mr. Reberg, no. Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rothman? Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard? Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, no. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young?
Has Mr. Jackson recorded?
Mr. Jackson is not recorded. Mr. Jackson votes aye.
All members voted? On this vote, the yeas are 14, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at desk number 2.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff, page 28, line 4, strike 100 million and insert
Request that it be waived.
179.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply restore ARPA-E funding to FY11 levels of $179 million. ARPA-E was created in 2009 to bring the kind of innovative thinking that is well known at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to the energy sector. That includes a focus on high-risk, high-reward R&D and a quick-moving culture made up of experts who stay just a few years to ensure that new ideas are continually being brought forward. Unlike some government agencies, its philosophy, much like a tech startup, is to hire the best technical staff and then hire the managers and leadership that can get the best out of them. This reinvention of the way the government does business is something we should be encouraging. The American Energy Innovation Council, made up of CEOs and chairmen of some of America's biggest companies, including Bill Gates, Norm Augustine, and Jeff Immelt, have proposed spending $1 billion a year on ARPA, seeing it as a vital part of our energy future. The bill provides just $100 million, so they have endorsed this amendment. I believe that we have a serious deficit problem and we need to deal with it. But as we make difficult choices needed to do that, I do not believe that as we emerge from recession, we should cut the innovative research that makes America great and has fueled our economic growth for generations. Energy is not just an economic issue, of course, it's also a national security issue. Some of ARPA-E's research may help us cut down on fuel convoys in Afghanistan, and every bit of energy independence protects us from even higher energy prices driven by instability in the Middle East or skyrocketing demand in China. More than 50 universities, like Caltech and MIT, among others, venture capital firms, professional societies, American Association of Universities, have signed a letter in support of this amendment. They and I hope that we will provide the funds ARPA-E needs to continue to do the research that will change the world, not today, but tomorrow and for decades to come.
Mr. Frelinghuysen.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment. The committee's top responsibility is to reduce government spending, and to that end, the bill decreases funding to approximately the 2005 level, which I've mentioned. Our colleagues' amendment would add funding to the ARPA-E account, which receives $100 million in the bill. The committee should note this amendment does not include an offset for the proposed increase and will require modifications to the 302B allocations, and therefore a decrease of funds for other committees, and for other reasons, I oppose the bill.
Mr. Visklosky.
Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. The chair mentioned the offsets. So my concern is ARPA-E is about a year to 18 months old. We also have 21 labs and technology centers at DOE. We have 46 energy frontier research centers. Assuming this bill is adopted in its entirety, we're going to have 5 hubs for energy innovation. We have 3 bioenergy research centers, and we have a joint Genome Institute. At this point, until DOE can prove they can manage programs adequately and stop creating more stovepipes, I'm not interested in pushing another $79 million at them.
Mr. Fatah.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment, and in contrary to what has been stated, I think that the principal responsibility of our committee should be for us to position America as the leader in the world in terms of energy. ARPA-E has done extraordinary work, for instance, in the battery space, in which we've moved into from almost no percent of the world's market to some 16% of the world's market in battery development. Pennsylvania's been a part of that. It is built on the DARPA example, which is, I think, to everyone in this room would agree, has done an extraordinary job in terms of promoting innovation. I think that it's a very business-centered approach in which people are hired. They only can stay for 3 to 5 years, in which you take the very best ideas and on a competitive basis support them. And you can just look at the venture capital dollars that have joined in now with these investments, in which it's moving us forward. So I can tell by the chairman and the ranking member's comment that Mr. Schiff's not going to win this amendment. I hope that that doesn't mean that we're conceding to China and other places in the world that they're going to win the energy race. And so I hope that we start to think anew about what level of responsibilities we have. It's not to cut the budget, it's to position our country to lead the world. And I would hope that on some other day the numbers would add up for an amendment like this. Thank you.
Mr. Schiff's recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleague for his comments. If there is an illustration of cutting the seed corn, I think, in the federal budget this year, this may be it. Energy is the cross-cutting issue of all time. It's a national security issue, an economic imperative, an environmental imperative, a health imperative. If we get it right, we can be the world leader and it can be an economic boon. If we get it wrong, it means that we're going to be mired as a second-rate power. I think the energy future is nothing less than that. This agency is doing what we want the government to do. It's acting in an innovative way. It's bringing people in for short-term stints to help create new things that are just beyond the edge in terms of invention. It's a model that works. We've seen it in DARPA. It's a model that can work here, and I hope that we will restore this funding, and I yield back.
All in favor of the amendment will say aye. 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 Opposed, no? No. The noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Hearing none, does Mr. Lewis have a motion?
Chairman, I move to favorably report the bill making appropriations for energy and water development and related agencies for the fiscal year 2012 to the House.
Mr. Dix. Recorded vote is requested on this motion. All in favor of taking a recorded vote will raise your hand. Sufficient number. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Austria. Mr. Austria, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro.
No.
Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Dix. Mr. Dix, no. Mrs. Emerson.
Aye.
Mrs. Emerson, aye. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen.
Jeff. Aye.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger.
Committee will be in order. Clerk has difficulty hearing.
Ms. Granger. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Hinchy. Mr. Hinchy, no. Mr. Honda.
Honda.
Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham, aye. Mr. LaTourette. Mr. LaTourette, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, no. Mrs. Lummis. Mrs. Lummis, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally.
Aye.
Mr. Nunnally, aye. Mr. Olver.
No.
Mr. Olver, no. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Price.
No.
Mr. Price, no. Mr. Reberg. Aye. Mr. Reberg, aye. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rothman.
No.
Mr. Rothman, no. Ms. Roybal Allard. No. Ms. Roybal Allard, no. Mr. Schiff.
No.
Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano.
No.
Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young.
Ms. Granger.
Gentlelady is not recorded.
Votes aye.
Ms. Granger, aye.
Have all members voted?
Don't mess with me, man.
Thank you very much.
Good work. You going back to the office, or?
On this vote, the yeas are 26, the nays are 20. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Good work.
Thank you. Good congratulations.
Yep.